My name is Amelia Montgomery. I am 32 years old. 2 hours ago, my younger sister Savannah grabbed a silver microphone in front of 300 of Georgia's wealthiest families and ordered me to leave her wedding. She stood under a crystal chandelier that cost more than my first house and told the crowd that my party planning hobby was an embarrassment to the Montgomery name. She said my energy was ruining the aesthetic of her perfect day. My parents sat at the head table sipping their champagne and let her do it. They watched me stand up from a table tucked behind a marble pillar by the kitchen swinging doors. They watched me place my linen napkin on the table and walk the entire length of the ballroom in silence. They smiled as I left. They thought they had finally put the spinster sister in her place to impress Savannah's new old money in-laws. What my family failed to realize was that I did not plan parties. I bought distressed hospitality assets, and 2 years ago I purchased the historic Peach Blossom Estate. The caterers serving their roasted quail were on my payroll. The lighting illuminating their imported orchids was wired to my breaker boxes. The venue they were sitting in belonged to me. 10 minutes after I walked out the door, I gave a single order to my property manager, and we plunged her perfect wedding into total darkness. Welcome back to Sophia Vengeance, where family secrets come to light and quiet women stop absorbing the damage of entitled families. Before I tell you how a single termination clause shut down the social event of the season, tell me how old you are and where you are listening from in the comments below. To understand how we reached that microphone, you need to understand the hierarchy of my family. In Georgia high society, weddings are not celebrations. They are acquisitions. On paper, the Montgomerys were Southern royalty. My father Richard ran a wealth management firm downtown. My mother Caroline spent her days directing charity galas. Savannah was the golden child bred for social climbing. I was the invisible one, the worker. While Savannah spent her 20s hunting for a husband with a legacy surname, I spent mine wearing steel-toed boots. I acquired failing coastal motels, I renovated historic venues, I built Montgomery Hospitality Group from a single small business loan into a sprawling, invisible empire. My family never asked for the name of my company. My mother simply referred to it as my little catering project. Sweat is unladylike, Amelia, she told me once, when I missed a family Easter dinner to oversee a foundation repair at one of my properties. Leave the grit to the hired help. Savannah knows how to attract real security. Savannah found that security in Preston. Preston's family owned commercial real estate across Atlanta. When the engagement was announced, my parents went into a frenzy. They were desperate to match Preston's family wealth to avoid looking inferior. Savannah demanded her wedding take place at the Peach Blossom Estate. It is the most exclusive venue on the Georgia coast, famous for its salt marshes and iconic peach orchards. It is also booked 3 years in advance. 8 months ago, my mother summoned me to a Sunday dinner. She did not invite me to celebrate the upcoming nuptials. She invited me to demand a favor. I arrived in my work clothes smelling faintly of the paint thinner we used at a recent renovation. My mother seated me at the far end of the dining table near the kitchen. She poured me a glass of sweet tea and slid a glossy brochure for the Peach Blossom Estate across the polished mahogany wood. "We have a logistical issue," she said, smoothing her cashmere cardigan. "Savannah has her heart set on this estate. They are telling us there is no availability until next decade. It is entirely unacceptable." I traced the embossed gold lettering of the estate logo on the brochure. It was the same logo printed on my corporate bank statements, the same estate I had purchased outright 24 months prior. "I need you to use your low-level industry connections to pull some strings," Caroline continued. "Speak to whoever runs the calendar, convince the owners to bump another bride, and secure the venue for your sister, and see what you can do about the pricing. Family carries family, Amelia. That is what we do." I looked across the table. Savannah was inspecting her diamond ring in the dining room light. My father was scrolling through golf scores on his phone, ignoring my presence entirely. I felt the cold condensation bleeding through the glass of sweet tea against my palm. I could have told them the truth right then. I could have pulled up the property deed on my phone and watched their faces drain of color. But looking at them, I realized they did not want my success. They wanted my submission. They wanted me to absorb their stress so Savannah could shine. "I will see what I can do," I told my mother, keeping my voice flat and even. "I know the venue manager. I can get you the date." Savannah rolled her eyes and took a sip of her wine. "Try to actually be useful for once, Amelia," she muttered. "Preston's mother is already judging us for having a blue-collar worker in the bridal party. Do not mess this up." I did not mess it up. I went back to my office the next morning and drafted the vendor and venue contracts myself. I instructed my manager Elias to handle the signing process with my parents. I made sure to include our standard luxury venue agreement with a very specific set of stipulations hidden in the fine print. I knew my father would never read the clauses carefully because he believed the people handling his events were beneath his attention. He signed the paperwork without a second glance, handing absolute binding authority over his social standing directly to the daughter he despised. The ink on that venue contract dried 8 months before the ballroom lights went out. To comprehend why my parents signed a document that gave a venue total authority over their reputation, you have to look at the financial panic driving this wedding. My father ran a wealth management firm, but his own portfolio was built on leveraged debt and country club posturing. He drove a leased European sedan and paid annual golf dues he could barely afford just to stay in the same room as men like Preston's father. Preston's family did not lease their vehicles. They owned the commercial real estate my father's firm rented. They were fifth-generation Atlanta money, the kind of wealth that speaks in whispers rather than shouts. When Savannah secured her engagement to Preston, the dynamic in my childhood home shifted from aspirational to frantic. The Montgomery name had to appear equal to the upcoming union. A country club reception would not suffice. A hotel ballroom was deemed pedestrian. Savannah required a location with historic gravity. She required the Peach Blossom Estate. The estate sits on 200 acres of pristine coastal marshland, framed by centuries-old live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. It hosts politicians, film directors, and industry titans. When my mother called the booking office, she was politely informed that our calendar was closed for the next 36 months. That rejection triggered the Sunday dinner I mentioned earlier, but the demand for a favor did not stop at securing the date. It extended to the cost. 3 days after I promised to pull strings, I sat in the corner of my parents' living room. Savannah was pacing across the Persian rug, scrolling through floral arrangements on her tablet. My mother was calculating catering costs on a legal pad, her brow furrowed in genuine anxiety. The initial quote my venue manager Elias sent them for a standard weekend buyout had sent my father into a quiet tailspin. "Amelia," my mother said, dropping her pen. She turned to me with a tight, strained smile. "This quote from the estate is steep. I thought you said you had leverage with these people." I set my coffee mug on a coaster. "I got you the date, Mom." Bumping a corporate retreat to fit Savannah into the spring schedule was the leverage. Savannah stopped pacing and glared at me. "You work in event planning, Amelia. You know the margins these places run. Tell them to cut the venue fee in half. Tell them the Montgomery name brings prestige to their little property." I looked at my sister. The Peach Blossom Estate generated more revenue in a single quarter than our father's firm did in 2 years. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep my expression neutral. "They do not discount the venue fee for prestige, Savannah," I said, keeping my voice level. "They are a luxury property." My father walked into the living room, loosening his silk tie. He pointed a finger at me. "You are going to go back to your contact and you are going to negotiate a family rate. Tell them we will give them a vendor shout-out in the society pages. We are not paying full list price for an empty building. Family carries family, Amelia. It is time you pulled your weight around here." They needed a severe discount because they could not afford the wedding they were pretending to host. They were risking their own financial ruin to buy Savannah a permanent seat at Preston's family table. I looked at the three of them standing together, a united front of entitlement. I could have refused. I could have walked out of the house and let them face the reality of their bank accounts. But if I refused, they would simply find another vendor to terrorize, to squeeze, and to exploit. "I will handle it," I said. "I will speak to the manager and get the contract revised." The next morning, I sat in my private office on the top floor of the Montgomery Hospitality Group headquarters. The walls were lined with the deeds and operating agreements of 15 different coastal properties. I pressed the intercom button and called Elias into my office. Elias had been with me since I bought my first dilapidated motel. He was sharp, loyal, and possessed a natural authority that commanded respect. He took a seat across from my mahogany desk. My parents are going to call you this afternoon, I told him, sliding the revised contract across the desk. They are going to demand a 70% discount on the estate rental. They will likely be condescending. They will mention my name as their low-level connection. Elias scanned the front page of the contract. His eyes narrowed. And you want me to grant this discount? I want you to agree to it, I said, leaning back in my leather chair. Put it in writing. Give them the 70% reduction on the venue fee, the catering, and the floral design. Make them feel like they just outsmarted the system. Elias flipped to the third page. He stopped reading. A slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. He tapped his pen against the paper. Clause 4B. Clause 4B, the vendor and staff harassment clause. I had spent years watching my mother belittle waitstaff and my sister berate retail workers. I knew exactly how they treated people they considered beneath them. The clause stipulated that the discounted rate was contingent upon the hosts maintaining professional and respectful conduct toward all venue staff, vendors, and ownership. Any verbal abuse, public humiliation, or hostility gave the venue the unilateral right to terminate all services immediately. Furthermore, a termination under this clause nullified any and all promotional discounts, applying the full premium rate to the final invoice payable upon receipt. They will never read this, Elias said. Richard Montgomery considers himself too important to read vendor terms and conditions. That is why I need you to hand it to him, I replied. Make sure he signs it in person. That afternoon, Elias met my parents in the grand foyer of the Peach Blossom estate. I watched the security footage later that evening. My father stood with his hands on his hips, inspecting the imported marble floors, while my mother critiqued the height of the floral urns. Elias played his part with flawless precision. He acted the part of a reluctant manager coerced by a low-level employee named Amelia into offering a steep discount. My father signed the contract without flipping past the first page. He did not ask for a lawyer to review it. He did not look at the LLC name at the top of the header. He just scrawled his signature, handed the pen back to Elias, and smiled a smug, self-satisfied smile. Over the next few months, the wedding planning escalated into a theater of absurdity. Savannah treated my presence like an unfortunate obligation. She summoned me to the catering tasting not to ask my opinion, but to fetch water and hold her coat. The tasting took place in the private dining room of my flagship restaurant. Our executive chef, a brilliant culinary artist named Julianne, prepared a menu of roasted quail butter, poached lobster, and truffle risotto. Savannah took one bite of the risotto and pushed the plate away in disgust. "It is too earthy," she complained loudly to Preston's mother, who sat across the table. "Why do these local chefs always try to mask poor technique with truffles?" Julianne stood near the door, her jaw clenched tight. She was a James Beard-nominated chef. I caught Julianne's eye and gave her a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent promise that this behavior would not go unanswered. My mother patted Savannah's hand. "Amelia will speak to the kitchen staff, dear. She knows how to deal with these blue-collar types. Amelia, go tell the chef to adjust the menu to Savannah's liking, and remind them they are working at cost." I stood up from my chair at the back of the room. I walked past my mother, my sister, and Preston's wealthy family. I walked into the kitchen and found Julianne wiping down a stainless steel prep station. "Keep the menu exactly as it is," I told her. "Let them complain." Julianne looked at me, wiping her hands on her apron. "They think they own this town, Amelia." I smiled, looking at the signed catering agreement on the clipboard hanging next to the walk-in freezer. They do not even own the chairs they are sitting on. The trap was set. The ink was dry. My family was careening toward a social disaster of their own making, fueled by their desperation to impress a family that would never truly accept them. They had signed away their protection, their leverage, and their dignity, all for the illusion of a discount. They thought they had secured the Peach Blossom estate through sheer Montgomery intimidation. They did not know that the estate was quietly waiting for them to break the rules, and the real test of those rules was about to begin at the rehearsal dinner. If you are listening to Morning Revenge right now, you already know that true power does not live in loud threats. It lives in the quiet paragraphs that arrogant people refuse to read. To my relatives, legal documentation was a trivial inconvenience. My father, Richard, viewed reviewing contract terms as a peasant task. His downtown wealth management office stood as a monument to superficial success. The corner suite featured polished mahogany desks that had never seen actual labor, and towering shelves lined with unread leather-bound books purchased solely for their aesthetic appeal. When I arrived at his suite on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he was practicing his putting stroke on a strip of synthetic turf. He wore a crisp, tailored suit and wore an expression of permanent, mild irritation. I carried a heavy manila folder under my right arm. Inside rested the Master Services Agreement for the upcoming wedding. It was a comprehensive document unifying the property rental, the culinary services, the floral design, and the valet operations into one single binding package. The top letterhead bore the discreet logo of MHG Holdings. It did not display my given name. It did not boast about my ownership. It simply laid the foundation for an inescapable trap. I sat on the edge of a leather guest chair and placed the thick stack of cream-colored paper on his pristine desk. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone masking the sound of the city traffic below. I knew exactly what rested on page 12 of that stack. Section 4, Paragraph B, the Vendor and Staff Harassment Clause. This was a standard protective measure I utilized across all my commercial properties to shield my employees from abusive clients. I had seen enough wealthy patrons treat service workers like disposable commodities to know that boundaries required severe financial teeth. But for this specific event, I had my legal team reinforce the language. The clause stated with unwavering clarity that any verbal assault, public humiliation, or hostile behavior directed at the service staff, the vendors, or the ownership granted the property management unilateral authority to cease all operations immediately. No warnings were required, no refunds would be issued. Furthermore, any promotional discounts would be instantly voided, rendering the host liable for the premium balance payable upon receipt of the final invoice. My father leaned his golf putter against the painted wall. He picked up his smartphone and began scrolling, his thumb swiping upward in rapid, repetitive motions. I watched his eyes dart across the bright screen. He was checking the live leaderboard for the Regional Country Club golf tournament. He did not even glance at the heavy folder resting mere inches from his hand. "Dad, you might want to review the termination conditions on page 12, I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. I was playing the role of the dutiful messenger, offering him a fair chance to save himself. The estate management is very strict about their operational guidelines, especially regarding how the staff is treated during large-scale events. He let out a short, dismissive scoff. He did not lift his eyes from the glowing screen. Lawyers handle the boring stuff, Amelia. That is why I pay junior associates to read fine print. I am not going to waste my afternoon reading catering rules and noise ordinances. Just show me where I need to sign so we can lock in this ridiculous discount you managed to scrape together." The heavy oak door of the office opened before I could reply. Elias stepped inside carrying his signature leather portfolio. I had instructed him to arrive 10 minutes after me, to act as the official representative of the property. He wore a tailored navy suit that hung perfectly on his frame, radiating a quiet authority that instantly dwarfed my father's performative wealth. My father looked up and assessed Elias with a quick, sweeping glance. He decided instantly that Elias was a subordinate. "You must be the manager my daughter pestered into giving us the family rate," my father said, extending a hand without standing up from his chair. "We appreciate you making an exception for the Montgomery family. We bring a certain caliber of clientele to your little venue." Elias shook his hand with a polite, blank expression. He did not correct the insult. "We hold our clients to a very specific standard, Mr. Montgomery. We just need your signature on the final page to formalize the arrangement and secure your date." My father reached into his breast pocket and produced a gold fountain pen. He flipped past 20 pages of meticulously drafted legal architecture. He bypassed the vendor requirements. He ignored the liability waivers. He skipped over page 12 entirely. He found the dotted line on the final page and scrawled his signature with a flourish. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick cream paper sounded exactly like a lock clicking shut. I watched the dark ink dry into the fibers of the page. My mind drifted back to the very first coastal motel I ever bought. The previous owner had tried to hide a devastating mechanic lien deep within the closing documents, hoping a young woman would be too naive to catch it. I had spent 3 sleepless nights reading every single sentence until I found the hidden debt. That was the week I learned that the world punishes those who skim. Savannah only read the brand names stitched into her designer handbags. My parents only read the society pages in the Sunday paper. They sincerely believed their surname was a magical shield protecting them from the consequences of their own arrogance. Elias retrieved the contract and slid it securely back into his leather portfolio. "Thank you for your business," Elias said, his voice smooth and professional. "We look forward to hosting your guests at the estate." As Elias walked out of the office, my father finally set his phone face down on the desk. He leaned back in his plush leather chair and steepled his fingers. "See, Amelia. That is how real business is done. A firm handshake and a recognizable name. You should take notes instead of running around fetching water for caterers and event planners." I offered a small, agreeable nod. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic calm. The weapon was fully loaded. The safety mechanism was officially off. I had just handed them a loaded gun, and they were pointing it directly at their own social standing. Having the legal right to destroy their facade was only the first step in this agonizing process. The true test of my endurance was still looming ahead. As the wedding week rapidly approached, Savannah's sense of entitlement morphed into sheer, unadulterated tyranny. She believed that the signed agreement meant she owned the property and every single person working on it. Her demands became increasingly erratic. Her temper grew volatile and cruel. The true collision was not going to happen quietly on a piece of paper in a downtown office. It was going to happen in front of our entire extended family and the wealthy in-laws at the rehearsal dinner. She was preparing to push the boundaries of her perceived power, and I was preparing to document every single violation. The evening air carried the sharp scent of the Atlantic salt marsh, blending seamlessly with the fragrant smoke of roasting cedar wood. The rehearsal dinner occupied the sprawling flagstone terrace of the Peach Blossom Estate. Above us, amber string lights wove through the thick canopy of ancient live oaks, casting a golden, cinematic glow over the gathering. Savannah sat at the center of a long banquet table draped in imported ivory linen. She wore a tailored white silk suit, radiating the triumphant energy of a woman who believed she had finally conquered Atlanta high society. Preston sat beside her, looking polished and adequately wealthy. His parents sat opposite them, projecting an aura of generational superiority. They dominated the primary tables near the stone balustrade overlooking the dark, shimmering water of the bay. I did not sit near the balustrade. My place card rested on a small circular table tucked into the deepest corner of the terrace. My chair backed directly into the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen prep area. Throughout the evening, I was treated to the constant rhythmic thud of the doors opening and closing. The distinct clatter of dirty silverware hitting plastic bus tubs served as my dinner soundtrack. Whenever a waiter hurried past holding a tray of discarded oyster shells, the smell of brine washed over my plate. My mother had orchestrated the seating arrangement with surgical precision. She wanted to ensure Preston's family did not have to interact with the daughter, who smelled like paint thinner on weekends. I drank sparkling water and observed the room. I cataloged the flow of the evening with the detached precision of a regional manager auditing a new property. I noted the temperature of the appetizers. I tracked the pour speed of the bartenders. I was working while my family played pretend. Halfway through the second course, a strong coastal breeze swept across the terrace. The wind caught the 12-foot floral arch standing behind Savannah's chair. The structure was an intricate, heavy copper frame wrapped tightly in white hydrangeas and trailing eucalyptus. The gust of wind exposed a structural flaw. The heavy frame groaned, tilting precariously forward by several degrees. Savannah shrieked, spilling a drop of Pinot Noir onto her silk lapel. She stood up, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the leaning arch. "Fix it," she snapped, directing her fury at a passing waitress who held a tray of water glasses. "I am not sitting under a collapsing pile of weeds. Get someone out here right now." The waitress froze, her eyes widening in panic. She did not build the arch. She did not know how to secure it. My mother rushed over, attempting to soothe Savannah while shooting venomous glares at the venue staff. I set my water glass down. I knew exactly which vendor constructed that arch, and I knew they had underestimated the sheer force of the coastal wind coming off the bay. I also knew that if the copper frame fell and injured a guest, my insurance premiums would skyrocket. I slipped out of my chair. No one noticed my departure. The entire terrace was captivated by Savannah's escalating tantrum and my father's loud demands for a manager. I pushed through the swinging doors, stepping into the bright, chaotic heat of the catering corridor. I bypassed the plating stations and walked down a narrow hallway reserved exclusively for property staff. I reached into my clutch and retrieved a heavy brass master key. I slid the key into the deadbolt of a locked maintenance closet and opened the door. The small room smelled of industrial pine cleaner and damp concrete. I scanned the metal shelving units. I grabbed a heavy-duty cordless drill, a handful of thick industrial zip ties, and a spool of transparent structural wire. I closed the door, locking it securely behind me. I navigated the perimeter of the terrace, moving through the shadows of the manicured hedges. I approached the back of the leaning floral arch under the cover of the ancient oaks. Through the thick wall of hydrangeas, I could hear Richard tapping a knife against a crystal flute, preparing to give a speech. I knelt on the cold flagstone. The copper base of the arch was wobbling. I looped the transparent structural wire around the primary load-bearing beam. I anchored the other end to the iron grating of a nearby drainage grate, pulling the line taut. I grabbed the cordless drill and drove a single heavy bolt through the copper bracket, securing it firmly into the mortar between the flagstones. The drill whirred with a low hum, easily masked by the ambient chatter and the distant sound of the crashing waves. I tested the frame with my shoulder. It held firm, rigid, and unyielding against the wind. I gathered my tools, retreated through the shadows, and returned the equipment to the maintenance closet. I washed the dust from my hands in a stainless steel utility sink. When I returned to my seat by the kitchen doors, my father was just concluding his toast. He raised his glass, speaking about legacy and the unmatched elegance of the Montgomery family. The crowd applauded politely. Carolyn leaned over the table, whispering loudly to Savannah, "Do you see the arch, darling? It is perfectly straight now. You just have to crack the whip and the invisible staff falls in line. They only respect authority." Savannah glanced at the sturdy floral frame and offered a smug, satisfied smile. "Exactly," she said. "You cannot let these blue-collar workers slack off for a single second." I picked up my fork and took a bite of roasted asparagus. The vegetables were perfectly crisp. I chewed slowly, letting the irony wash over my palate. They were praising the invisible help while sitting mere feet from the owner, who had literally bolted their fragile illusion to the ground. As the plates were cleared, Victoria Preston's mother decided to make her rounds. She was a tall, imposing woman who wore her old money arrogance like a tailored coat. Her posture was rigidly straight, and a diamond tennis bracelet caught the amber light every time she moved her wrist. She approached Savannah's table, projecting an air of practiced condescension. "Savannah, darling," Victoria purred, resting a hand on the back of my sister's chair. "The evening is lovely, simply lovely." Savannah beamed, leaning into the praise. "Thank you, Victoria. We wanted everything to reflect Preston's exquisite taste." Victoria's gaze drifted past Savannah, landing squarely on me in my dark corner. She offered a tight, thin-lipped smile that contained zero genuine warmth. "It is so nice that your sister could take a night off from the trenches to join us. It must be exhausting running around coordinating all those little parties. Every family seems to have one, do they not? The spinster sister, working behind the scenes." Savannah let out a bright, chiming laugh. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the terrace, sharp and cruel. "Oh, Amelia loves the trenches, Victoria. She prefers the dirt. She would not know what to do with herself if she had to actually sit down and be a guest." My mother chimed in, nodding enthusiastically. "Amelia has always been our little worker bee. Someone has to handle the unglamorous details." I held Victoria's gaze. I did not flinch. I did not avert my eyes. I felt the smooth, cool condensation on my water glass against my fingertips. I cataloged the interaction with clinical precision. Savannah was pushing the boundary, testing the limits of her perceived dominance. She was establishing a documented pattern of hostility. The vendor contract required explicit verbal abuse to trigger a termination. Savannah was building the precedent layer by layer, insult by insult. She was handing me the rope she intended to hang herself with. I smiled, a very small, tight smile that did not reach my eyes. "I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, Victoria," I said, my voice smooth and unbothered. "The staff works very hard to ensure every guest gets exactly what they deserve." Victoria turned away, dismissing me entirely. Savannah went back to sipping her wine, her ego inflated by the shared cruelty. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the kitchen doors swing open and shut behind my shoulders. The rehearsal dinner was merely the prologue. The true test of Savannah's unchecked arrogance would commence when the sun rose. Tomorrow was the wedding day. Tomorrow she would have a frantic bridal suite, a ticking clock, and an army of vendors she erroneously believed she controlled. I knew my sister better than anyone. Under pressure, her fake southern sweetness always evaporated, leaving nothing but toxic entitlement. Tomorrow morning, the real structural damage would begin, and no amount of transparent wire would be able to hold her perfect facade together. Morning light broke across the salt marsh, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns of the estate. Inside the bridal suite, the air conditioning struggled against the rising coastal humidity and the body heat of 8 nervous bridesmaids. The room smelled sharply of aerosol hairspray, stale champagne, and impending disaster. Savannah paced the length of the room. Her silk robe billowed behind her. She checked the diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist for the 4th time in 60 seconds. "It is 8 minutes past the hour," she said, her voice rising an octave. "Where is the glam team? They are ruining my timeline." My mother fluttered around Savannah, holding a glass of sparkling water. "Breathe, darling," Caroline murmured. "Traffic on the causeway is always unpredictable this time of year." Savannah spun around, slapping the glass out of my mother's hand. Water splashed across the hardwood floor, soaking into the perimeter rug. "I do not care about traffic. I care about my photographs." I sat in a wingback chair in the corner, methodically steaming a stray wrinkle out of a bridesmaid dress. I watched my sister use panic as a weapon. This was her established pattern. When we were teenagers, a delayed flight to a family vacation resulted in Savannah throwing her luggage down a flight of stairs. My parents excused the behavior, calling it artistic temperament. I recognized it as a fundamental lack of emotional regulation. The heavy oak door of the suite swung open. Monica, the lead artist, walked in carrying a heavy metal cosmetics case. 2 assistants followed closely behind her. Monica was a seasoned professional. Her boutique styling agency was actually a subsidiary of Montgomery Hospitality Group, acquired during a corporate buyout 3 years prior. She was punctual, efficient, and did not tolerate disrespect. "I am sorry for the slight delay, Savannah," Monica said, setting her case on the vanity. "A supply truck overturned on the Marsh Bridge and blocked both lanes. We had to take the service road." Savannah marched toward the vanity, her face flushed red. "Do you know who I am?" she hissed. "Do you know who my future husband is?" Monica unsnapped the latches of her case. "Yes, I am aware. Now, if you will take a seat, we can catch up on the timeline." "Do not tell me to take a seat," Savannah shrieked. "You are hired help. You are 8 minutes late on the most important day of my life. I will destroy your little agency. I will post reviews on every bridal forum in the state of Georgia. I will ensure no one in Atlanta ever hires you to paint a face again. You are nothing but a glorified mall kiosk worker." The room went dead silent. The bridesmaids stared at the floor. My mother stood frozen, unwilling to intervene and risk drawing the fire onto herself. Monica stopped unpacking her brushes. She looked at Savannah with cold, flat eyes. She slowly placed a foundation bottle back into its designated slot. She snapped the metal latches of her case shut. "I do not work under threat," Monica said, her tone even. "Find another team to do your makeup. We are leaving." Monica turned on her heel and walked out the door, her assistants trailing behind her. Savannah gasped, clutching the lapels of her silk robe. She looked at my mother. "Fix this," she demanded. Carolyn wrung her hands, looking at the closed door. "I do not know what to do. Amelia, do something." I unplugged the fabric steamer. I set it neatly on a side table. I walked out of the suite and let the heavy door click shut behind me. The hallway was lined with antique mirrors and floral wallpaper. Monica was marching toward the elevator banks, her boots clicking sharply against the floorboards. "Monica?" I said, keeping my voice low and steady. She stopped and turned around. "I am sorry, Amelia. I know she is your sister, but I do not tolerate that kind of abuse from anyone, not even a Montgomery." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my checkbook. I did not carry it for personal expenses. I carried it for structural emergencies. "You have every right to walk away," I told her, stepping closer so our voices would not echo down the corridor. Her behavior was unacceptable, but I need you to stay. Monica crossed her arms. "Why should I endure that level of disrespect?" I opened a leather cover of the checkbook because a private cancellation in a hotel suite does not carry any weight. If she ruins this morning, only the bridesmaids will know what kind of person she truly is. She needs to make it to the reception. She needs an audience. Monica studied my face. She had worked under my corporate umbrella long enough to understand that I did not make emotional pleas. I made strategic investments. I am authorizing a hazard pay bonus for you and your assistants, I said, writing a figure on the line that was triple her standard daily rate. Cashable today. You go back in there. You do your job flawlessly. You ignore her tantrums. You get her down the aisle. I tore the check from the ledger and held it out. Monica looked at the amount. Her expression softened marginally. She took the slip of paper and folded it into her pocket. You are paying a high price for a front row seat to a disaster, Monica noted. It is not a disaster, I replied. It is a demolition. There is a difference. Monica nodded once. She signaled her assistants and they turned back toward the bridal suite. I waited in the hallway for 2 minutes, allowing them to re-enter and set up their stations. When I pushed the door open, Savannah was sitting in the velvet vanity chair. Monica was applying a primer to her skin with mechanical, icy precision. Savannah caught my eye in the mirror. A smug, satisfied smile stretched across her face. "See, Amelia," Savannah said, her voice dripping with unearned triumph. "That is how you handle the working class. You have to show them who holds the power. If you let them walk all over you, they will never respect you." She came crawling back the second she realized I could end her career. I walked over to the closet and retrieved my garment bag. I did not bother correcting her delusion. I did not mention the hazard pay resting in Monica's pocket. I simply let Savannah build her false narrative. Every time she claimed a fake victory, she pushed herself closer to the edge of the real cliff. I unzipped the canvas bag and pulled out my dress. It was a simple, elegant column gown in a muted slate gray. It lacked the sequins, the ruffles, and the heavy embellishments my mother had selected for the other bridesmaids. Caroline had called it severe. I considered it functional armor. I stepped into the adjoining bathroom to change. The cold porcelain tiles grounded me. I slipped the fabric over my shoulders and adjusted the discreet zipper. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were calm. My pulse was steady. The contrast between my quiet preparation and the chaotic noise of the suite was stark. Savannah was building a kingdom out of shouting and empty threats. I was managing an empire built on contracts and hazard pay. She believed her loud voice was the ultimate weapon. I knew that the true power lay in the silent structural control of the environment itself. I applied a minimalist layer of makeup. I pinned my hair back into a sleek, practical twist. I did not need to shine today. I only needed to observe. When I stepped back into the main suite, Savannah was fully painted. She looked beautiful in a brittle manufactured way. Her dress was an elaborate confection of tulle and imported lace. It looked heavy. It looked like a costume designed for a play rather than a garment meant for a marriage. My mother clasped her hands together, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, darling," Caroline whispered, "you look like royalty. Preston is going to be stunned." Savannah stood up and admired her profile in the full-length mirror. She smoothed the front of her skirt. "Of course he will be stunned. I am giving his family exactly what they paid for. Perfection." She turned to look at me, her gaze sweeping over my understated dress. She let out a small sigh of pity. "Well, Amelia, you look fine. Just try to stay near the back during the photographs. The gray washes you out, and we need the color palette to remain vibrant for the society page feature." "I will stand exactly where I need to stand," I replied softly. The wedding coordinator knocked twice on the suite door. The brass hinges creaked as it opened. A young woman holding a clipboard smiled nervously at the room. "It is time," the coordinator announced. "The guests are seated in the orchard. The groom is waiting at the altar." Savannah took a deep breath, centering her fake Southern charm. "Let us go secure this legacy," she said. We filed out of the suite and walked toward the elevators. The inevitable collision between my sister's fragile ego and the harsh reality of her signed contracts was only a few hours away. The ceremony was the final parade before the reception, and I knew that once the alcohol started flowing, the real Savannah would take the microphone. The Georgia's sun beat down on the sprawling orchard, casting dappled shadows across the manicured grass. Row after row of ancient fruit trees formed a natural cathedral arching over the center aisle. The air hung heavy with the scent of sweet blossoms and expensive perfume. 300 guests sat in gilded wooden chairs, fanning themselves with custom-printed programs. This was not a union of two people. It was a corporate merger of two fragile empires. Preston's relatives occupied the first 3 rows on the right side of the aisle. They sat with rigid, perfect posture, wearing tailored suits and understated designer dresses. They represented old money, an invisible fortress of generational prosperity that did not need to shout to be heard. Their wealth was quiet and secure. My parents sat in the front row on the left, projecting a desperate imitation of that same affluence. My father constantly adjusted his silk tie, while my mother smiled a bright, fixed smile at anyone who glanced in her direction. They were terrified of being exposed as imposters. They treated every interaction as a transaction designed to elevate their social standing. The string quartet played a classical overture as the bridal party proceeded down the aisle. I walked in step with the music, keeping my gaze forward. When Savannah finally appeared, the collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible. She glided down the runner, a vision of manufactured perfection. The vows they exchanged at the altar were hollow recitations written by a professional copywriter. They spoke of eternal devotion and unyielding partnerships, but their eyes constantly darted toward the photographer's lens, ensuring their angles were captured correctly. It was a performance designed exclusively for the society pages. There was no authentic emotion radiating from the altar. There was only calculated ambition. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into polite applause. The newly minted couple turned and began their recessional walk back up the aisle. As Savannah passed my position near the front, I noticed a glaring defect in her flawless armor. A long, jagged thread had worked itself loose from the intricate hem of her imported lace veil. It dragged across the rough outdoor runner, catching on a stray twig. For a fraction of a second, my muscles tensed. My instinct, forged over 3 decades of being the family problem solver, screamed at me to step forward. I could easily reach down, snap the fiber, and save the expensive fabric from unraveling further. In the past, I would have done it without hesitation. I would have protected her image at my own expense. I would have quietly absorbed the burden of maintaining her pristine presentation. I looked at the frayed string snagging on the wood. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me. I let the veil drag. I let the lace pull. It was a microscopic withdrawal of my care, but it felt like breaking a heavy iron chain. I was no longer the custodian of their mistakes. I watched the thread stretch and snap against a pebble, leaving a tiny, jagged flaw in the otherwise perfect silhouette. The guests were ushered toward the terrace for cocktail hour, while the bridal party remained in the orchard for formal photography. A famous lifestyle photographer from Charleston barked orders, waving his hands to arrange us under a particularly large oak tree. He directed Preston's family first, snapping dozens of frames with rapid precision. Then he called for the Montgomerys. My father puffed out his chest, standing proudly next to Preston. My mother positioned herself elegantly beside Savannah. I stepped up to take my place on the edge of the grouping. "Wait," Savannah said, narrowing her eyes at my slate gray dress. She held up her hand, stopping me in my tracks. "The color balance is wrong," she complained to the photographer. "Your dress is washing out the floral backdrop, Amelia." The photographer lowered his camera, looking uncomfortable. "I can adjust the lighting in post-production," he offered, trying to keep the peace and move the schedule along. "No," Savannah insisted, waving her hand dismissively. "I want the raw images to be flawless. Amelia, step out of the frame. We need a few core family shots without you ruining the aesthetic. You can jump in for the extended relative photos later." Extended relative. I was her biological sister. I looked at my parents, waiting for a defense that I knew would never arrive. My parents did not object. My father checked his watch, and my mother busied herself adjusting Savannah's bouquet. They were entirely complicit in my erasure. They preferred the visual lie of a perfect trio over the reality of a complete family. My presence was an inconvenience to their curated narrative. I did not argue. I did not show a single trace of hurt or indignation. I simply nodded, took 3 steps backward, and walked out of the camera frame. I left them posing under the Georgia sun, a picture-perfect family built on a foundation of deception. The camera clicked, freezing their artificial smiles into permanent history. I walked toward the edge of the orchard where the catering vans were parked out of sight. Elias stood leaning against the trunk of a tall oak tree, holding his ever-present leather clipboard. He had watched the entire portrait session from a distance. His jaw was locked in a tight, furious line. "I cannot believe you just let them do that," Elias said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "She literally banished you from your own family portrait, on your own property. She treated you like a stranger who wandered onto the set." I stood beside him, watching the camera flash go off in the distance. "The lighting is better over here anyway," I replied, keeping my tone light and unaffected. Elias turned to face me, his dark eyes flashing with genuine anger on my behalf. "Tell me the word, Amelia. Say it right now, and I will cut the power to the cocktail hour. I will send the valet staff home. We can pull the plug early and leave them stranded in the dirt. I can have this entire estate locked down in 5 minutes." I looked out over the rows of peach trees. The urge to end the charade immediately was a burning pressure in my chest, but I forced it down. Strategy always outlasts impulse. Emotion makes you reckless, but patience makes you untouchable. "Not yet," I told him. "If we shut it down now, they will just play the victim. They will tell Preston's family that the venue had a mechanical failure. They will spin a narrative where they are the tragic heroes of a ruined event. We need the termination to be explicitly their fault. The breach of contract must be public, undeniable, and recorded by 300 witnesses." Elias crossed his arms over his chest. "How much more abuse do you need to endure to satisfy the contract parameters? They have already insulted you in front of the groom." "It is not about enduring abuse, Elias," I explained, turning to look him in the eye. "It is about waiting for the correct stage. Reputations take decades to build, but only an audience to destroy. Savannah is arrogant, but she is also a performer. She will not be able to resist flaunting her power when everyone is seated for dinner. She needs a microphone. She needs the attention of 300 people to feel truly validated. That is when she will cross the line." Elias slowly nodded, understanding the tactical patience required for total victory. He tapped his clipboard against his leg. "The catering staff is prepped. The breakers are ready. The moment she violates the harassment clause, on the record, the property goes dark. We are on standby." I turned my attention back to the photo session. Savannah was laughing, tossing her head back for a candid shot. The frayed thread on her veil had snagged again, tearing a visible hole in the delicate lace near her ankle. She had not noticed it yet. She was too busy admiring her own reflection in the eyes of her wealthy in-laws. The cocktail hour was winding down. The ambient chatter of the guests drifted across the lawn, carried by the warm coastal breeze. The catering staff would soon begin ushering the attendees into the grand ballroom for the reception. The multi-course dinner was prepared, the champagne towers were assembled, and the speeches were scheduled. The air grew thick with anticipation and the inevitable weight of consequence. The trap was laid out in plain sight, and all I had to do was take my seat at table 19 and wait for my sister to reach for the microphone. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open, revealing a space designed to intimidate. 300 guests spilled from the terrace into the interior of the Peach Blossom estate. 100 crystal prisms hung from the ceiling, refracting warm amber light across the gold leaf trim of the crown molding. The room smelled of roasted thyme and expensive floral arrangements. Waiters in pressed white coats stood at strict attention, offering trays of vintage champagne as the elite of Georgia society found their assigned seats. I found my seat at table 19. It was positioned at the very edge of the room, tucked discreetly behind a wide marble pillar near the kitchen access corridor. From this vantage point, the head table was a distant, glowing island. I sat between a distant elderly cousin who had already fallen asleep and a business associate of my father's who spent the entire first course checking his email. The placement was deliberate. My mother had physically mapped out the room to ensure my slate gray dress did not pollute the background of the primary videography angles. I was kept out of sight. I was banished to the shadows of my own building. The culinary team executed the dinner service with militaristic precision. Julianne, my executive chef, had ignored Savannah's ignorant complaints from the tasting. The menu remained uncompromised. Waitstaff moved through the narrow spaces between tables in synchronized waves, setting down plates of butter-poached lobster and truffle risotto. The aroma of rich earth and fresh sea salt wafted through the ballroom. I watched the guests take their first bites. I saw eyes widen in genuine surprise. I heard low murmurs of profound appreciation ripple across the tables. Preston's family, accustomed to private chefs and elite dining clubs, nodded in rare approval. They were consuming perfection. They were praising the execution of a flawless hospitality machine. They did not know the architect of that machine sat quietly in the dark corner drinking sparkling water from a standard crystal tumbler. I chewed a piece of tender lobster tail, evaluating the temperature and the seasoning. It was impeccable. Julianne had delivered a culinary triumph. I made a mental note to increase her quarterly bonus. As the plates were cleared, the ambient chatter lowered. The clinking of silver against porcelain faded into a hushed, expectant silence. The formal speeches were scheduled to begin. Preston's father Arthur stood up from the head table. He adjusted the lapels of his custom tuxedo and tapped a spoon against his glass. The sharp ring echoed through the acoustic perfection of the ballroom. Arthur carried himself with the heavy, unquestioned authority of a man whose grandfather had built entire city blocks in downtown Atlanta. He leaned toward the microphone placed at the center of the table. "Welcome, everyone," Arthur began, his voice a rich baritone that commanded immediate attention. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate the union of two distinct paths converging into a single shared future. When Preston first introduced us to Savannah, we were naturally protective. Our family heritage requires a certain standard. We value tradition. We value ambition. We value those who understand the heavy responsibility of carrying a legacy forward." Arthur paused, letting his words settle over the room. He looked at my parents, seated a few feet away. "We are pleased to say that the Montgomery family represents an equal caliber of excellence," Arthur continued. "It is rare to find a family that aligns so perfectly with our own principles. Richard and Caroline have raised a daughter who understands the weight of our society. Tonight is not merely a wedding. It is a merger of two proud Georgia families who refuse to settle for anything less than extraordinary." Polite applause erupted from the crowd. Preston squeezed Savannah's hand. Savannah beamed, radiating a smug triumph that bordered on blinding. My parents puffed their chests forward, absorbing the validation they had bankrupted themselves to secure. I sat behind the marble pillar, tracing the rim of my water glass with my index finger. Equal caliber. The irony was so dense it felt tangible. Arthur believed he was merging his generational wealth with an equal powerhouse of financial stability. He did not know Richard Montgomery's wealth management firm was currently drowning in leveraged debt. He did not know Caroline Montgomery bought her designer gowns at luxury consignment shops. He did not know the extravagant dinner he just consumed was subsidized by a woman sitting next to the kitchen doors. The applause died down, and Arthur took his seat. My father stood up next. Richard buttoned his suit jacket, projecting an air of supreme confidence. He grasped the microphone, pulling it closer to his mouth. He scanned the room, his eyes gliding right past the shadowy corner where table 19 sat. "Thank you, Arthur Richard," said his voice echoing through the speakers. "And thank you to everyone who traveled to be here tonight. Hosting an event of this magnitude requires a specific vision. When Savannah told me she dreamed of marrying at the Peach Blossom Estate, I knew we had to make it happen. People told me this venue was impossible to book. They said the waiting list was 3 years long." Richard let out a soft chuckling sound, leaning into his manufactured persona of the ultimate deal-maker. "But in business, and in life, you do not accept the word impossible," Richard boasted. "You leverage your influence. You make the right calls to the right people. You negotiate. I personally ensured that this estate opened its doors for my daughter tonight because a Montgomery always secures the finest arrangements. We do not take no for an answer. We command respect and we deliver excellence." The crowd clapped enthusiastically. The wealthy guests nodded along, appreciating the narrative of a powerful patriarch securing a prized asset for his family. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The cool liquid slid down my throat, doing nothing to extinguish the slow-burning fire in my chest. My father was standing on a stage I purchased, boasting about a negotiation that never happened. He was claiming victory over a waiting list that I personally instructed Elias to bypass. He was wearing a crown he stole from my desk. Every boastful laugh from the head table acted as a ticking clock. The tension in the ballroom wound tighter and tighter, wrapping around the crystal chandeliers and sinking into the floorboards. The room was a pressurized cabin, and the oxygen was rapidly depleting. My family had built a towering monument to their own vanity. They constructed it with lies, insecurity, and a blatant disregard for the very daughter who laid the foundation beneath their feet. They felt invincible. They believed their social performance had successfully cemented their status forever. But arrogance always breeds carelessness. The speeches were intended to conclude with my father. The schedule dictated that the band would begin playing immediately after Richard offered a final toast. The timeline was rigidly structured to transition the guests onto the dance floor. But Savannah could never let someone else hold the spotlight for too long. As my father moved to set the microphone back on the table, Savannah reached out her manicured hand. Her fingers wrapped around the silver handle, pulling it toward her own chair. She had consumed 3 glasses of vintage champagne during dinner. Her cheeks were flushed with alcohol and the dizzying high of public adoration. She stood up, pushing her chair back. The heavy silk of her wedding dress rustled loudly in the quiet room. She gripped the microphone, smiling out at the 300 guests. My pulse shifted. A steady, rhythmic thrum echoed in my ears. I knew the look on her face. It was the same look she wore when she destroyed my childhood science project because it garnered more attention than her cheerleading routine. It was the look of a predator who feels entirely safe in her own territory. Savannah tapped the microphone. The sound was sharp and unforgiving. The band leader, who had raised his baton to cue the music, slowly lowered his arm. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. I sat perfectly still behind the marble pillar. I watched my sister raise the microphone to her lips, preparing to say the words that would inevitably burn her perfect world to the ground. The final countdown had officially begun. The sharp whine of audio feedback pierced the elegant hum of the reception. Savannah stood holding the silver microphone, her knuckles white from gripping the metal handle so tightly. She swayed slightly on her designer heels. The vintage champagne had clearly eroded whatever thin layer of social filter she normally maintained. The ballroom grew quiet. Hundreds of guests turned their attention back to the head table, anticipating a sweet conclusion to the formal toasts. Preston sat beside her, wearing a loose, relaxed smile. He assumed his new wife was about to deliver a charming display of gratitude. My parents leaned forward in their chairs, their expressions caught between pride and mild apprehension. They knew Savannah's volatile nature better than anyone, but they also believed the sheer wealth in the room would force her to behave. They were wrong. Savannah did not view the wealth in the room as a reason to show restraint. She viewed it as a weapon she had just acquired, and she was eager to test the blade. "I want to thank everyone for being part of my flawless evening," Savannah began, her voice amplified through the state-of-the-art sound system I had personally installed last autumn. She looked out over the sea of tuxedos and imported silk gowns, but weddings are not just about wearing a pretty dress. They are about surrounding yourself with success. They are about aligning with people who reflect your own high caliber. She paused, letting the word caliber echo across the acoustic ceiling panels. She turned her head, scanning the room. Her gaze swept past the crystal centerpieces, past the wealthy in-laws, and landed squarely on the dark corner where table 19 sat. I felt the sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. A predator had located its target. When we were children, Savannah used to mask her academic failures by mocking my clothing in front of her friends. Whenever she felt small, she needed to make someone else feel smaller. Marrying into Preston's family had triggered a deep, profound insecurity within her. She was surrounded by generational titans, and she desperately needed to establish her own dominance. I was the designated sacrifice, Amelia Savannah said, her tone dripping with a highly concentrated, artificial sweetness. 300 heads swiveled in my direction. The guests seated at my table shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, leaning away from me, as if failure was a contagious disease. "I know it must be incredibly difficult for you to be here tonight," Savannah continued, her voice rising, projecting across the silent space. "It has to be hard, sitting in the shadows, watching real people build actual legacies while you are still playing around with your little catering hobby." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. It was not a gasp of horror. It was the sound of wealthy people registering a social execution and deciding not to intervene. I looked at the head table. My mother, Caroline, lowered her eyes to her lap, hiding a faint smirk behind her linen napkin. My father, Richard, swirled the amber bourbon in his glass, offering zero intervention. They were letting her do it. They were sacrificing my dignity to appease Savannah's ego, proving once and for all that my place in the Montgomery hierarchy was permanently fixed at the bottom. You spend your life fetching ice and organizing folding chairs. Savannah mocked her tone, shedding the sweet facade and turning brittle and sharp. You smell like kitchen grease and cheap paint half the time. It is an embarrassment to the Montgomery name. We are a family of prestige, and you are nothing but a blue-collar worker pretending to belong in our world. The laughter started at the head table. Preston's mother, Victoria, let out a soft, amused chuckle. That single sound acted as a permission slip for the rest of the room. The polite murmurs morphed into a wave of cruel collective laughter. It was a suffocating, ugly noise. 300 elite members of Georgia society sat in a luxury venue, laughing at the woman they believed was a glorified servant. I did not flush. I did not avert my gaze. I sat perfectly still, bathed in the dim light of the corner's shadow. I felt the cold, smooth surface of my water glass against my fingertips. My pulse maintained a steady resting rate. I was operating in a state of clinical detachment, recording every spoken word and cross-referencing it against a legally binding document. Savannah fed on the laughter. It fueled her. She stepped out from behind the head table, dragging the microphone cord behind her. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "In fact, your energy is ruining the aesthetic of my reception," Savannah declared, her voice ringing with finality. "You are a stain on this beautiful venue. You do not belong among people of this caliber. Get out, Amelia. You are ruining my perfect day. Leave right now." The laughter abruptly ceased. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The guests stared at me, waiting for the inevitable reaction. They expected tears. They expected me to flee the room sobbing into my hands. They expected a dramatic, trembling exit that would confirm my status as the weak, discarded sister. I took a slow, quiet breath. Savannah had just crossed the threshold. She had delivered public humiliation. She had engaged in explicit verbal abuse. She had directed hostile behavior at the venue ownership. The rigid requirements of Clause 4B were now fully satisfied. The legal mechanism was triggered. I did not cry. I did not argue. I lifted my hands and picked up my pristine white linen napkin. I folded it neatly in half and placed it parallel to my silver fork on the porcelain plate. The tiny clink of the metal against the china sounded incredibly loud in the frozen silence of the ballroom. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my slate gray dress. I stepped away from table 19 and began the long walk toward the back of the room. The distance from my chair to the mahogany double doors was roughly 80 feet. Every single step felt calculated and precise. My heels clicked against the reclaimed heart pine floorboards, establishing a steady, rhythmic cadence. The guests watched me, tracking my movement with wide, judging eyes. I felt their stares pressing into my shoulders, but their opinions carried zero weight. They were looking at a humiliated sister retreating in defeat. They did not understand. They were looking at a landlord preparing an eviction notice. As I walked past the center of the room, I caught Preston's gaze. He looked vaguely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, but he said nothing. He was marrying into a toxic dynamic, and he lacked the spine to challenge it. I looked at my father. Richard wore an expression of mild annoyance, as if my slow exit was delaying his access to the dance floor. He had no concept of the avalanche hanging directly above his head. I reached the back of the ballroom. I did not turn around to offer a final dramatic glare. I did not look back at Savannah standing victorious near the head table, clutching her microphone like a trophy. She believed she had won the ultimate battle. She believed she had permanently erased me from her narrative. I raised my hands and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. The hinges yielded smoothly, offering no resistance. I stepped over the brass threshold, leaving the suffocating heat of the reception behind me. The cool night air of the coastal Georgia evening washed over my face, smelling of salt marsh and blooming jasmine. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the ambient noise of the ballroom. The silence of the foyer was profound and clean. I was no longer the punching bag for the Montgomery family. I was the sole proprietor of Montgomery Hospitality Group, and I had just been handed the legal right to end the charade. The time for silent endurance was over. The time for structural consequences had arrived. The heavy mahogany panels sealed shut behind me, severing the audio feed of my sister's triumphant reception. The grand foyer offered a stark sanctuary of quiet marble and polished brass. I took a deep breath of the purified air-conditioned space, letting the lingering scent of roasted thyme and vintage champagne fade from my senses. The transition from the chaotic ballroom to the silent entryway felt like stepping off a speeding train onto a solid concrete platform. Elias stood adjacent to the sweeping curved staircase. He held a black two-way radio in his right hand. His posture was rigid. He had listened to the entire speech through the live audio feed connected to his earpiece. The muscle in his jaw feathered a silent testament to his barely contained outrage on my behalf. He did not offer empty apologies. He did not ask how I felt. He was a professional awaiting a tactical directive. I walked toward him. My footsteps echoed sharply across the pristine tiles. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to dismantle a dynasty. I looked directly into his dark, focused eyes. "Execute Clause 4B, I said. Shut it down." A slow, grim smile touched the corners of Elias' mouth. He lifted the radio to his lips, pressing the transmission button. All channels, he stated, his voice a low, gravelly command. "Code black. I repeat, code black. Terminate all services immediately. Host breach confirmed. Initiate full operational shutdown." I bypassed the main entrance doors and exited through the private owner corridor. The humid Georgian night embraced me, carrying the symphony of chirping cicadas and the rhythmic crashing of the distant ocean waves. I walked across the gravel path toward the designated VIP parking enclave. My dark, customized SUV sat under the canopy of a weeping willow tree. I unlocked the doors with a silent electronic pulse. I climbed into the driver's seat. I did not start the engine. I rolled down the tinted window, allowing the coastal breeze to filter through the cabin. I rested my hands on the leather steering wheel and turned my gaze toward the glowing windows of the Peach Blossom estate. From the outside, the mansion looked like a glowing jewel box, overflowing with light and music. But inside, the structural veins of the operation were freezing over. I knew exactly what was happening behind those brick walls. I had designed the emergency termination protocol myself. In the cavernous stainless steel kitchen, Julianne stood at the primary expediting station. She was in the middle of garnishing 60 plates of truffle risotto for the late-night service. When Elias' voice crackled through the overhead communication speaker, she stopped. She held a pair of silver plating tongs suspended in midair. She looked at her sous chefs. "Drop the trays," Julianne ordered. "We are done." The culinary brigade moved with the synchronized precision of a military unit. They did not ask questions. They had endured hours of condescension from the Montgomery guests. They had listened to Savannah complain about their technique during the tasting and felt the sting of her arrogant dismissals all evening. They were eager to execute the withdrawal. Waiters returning from the dining room with empty hands were blocked at the swinging doors. "Do not go back out," Julianne instructed them. "Stay in the corridor." The brigade unplugged the industrial warming cabinets. The loud hissing of venting steam filled the kitchen as they killed the heat on the commercial stoves. Half-finished plates of expensive seafood were unceremoniously dumped into the stainless steel compost bins. The culinary artists stripped off their white aprons, tossing them into the linen hampers. They wiped down their stations, securing the expensive cutlery into locked metallic cases. The lifeblood of the reception, the endless flow of premium food, stopped dead in its tracks. Across the venue, in the mirrored alcove serving as the primary beverage station, the shutdown was equally ruthless. 2 veteran bartenders had spent the last 3 hours pouring top-shelf bourbon for Preston's arrogant groomsmen. They had swallowed insults about their pouring speed and endured snapped fingers demanding immediate service. When the radio on the back counter buzzed with the code black directive, they did not hesitate. One bartender reached under the counter and retrieved a heavy ring of brass keys. He immediately locked the custom-built liquor cabinet, snapping the deadbolts into place. A wealthy guest approached, holding an empty crystal tumbler, snapping his fingers for a refill. The bartender looked at the patron and shook his head. "Service is closed, sir," he stated flatly. He reached up and grabbed the handle of the heavy security grate concealed in the ceiling archway. With one swift downward pull, the iron lattice descended. It hit the marble countertop with a sharp, echoing clang, locking the guests out of the alcohol supply. The sudden metallic noise startled the nearby attendees, but the bartenders merely turned their backs, retrieving their personal belongings from the staff lockers. Outside on the sprawling circular driveway, the valet team received the same transmission. The valet captain, a retired Marine who managed my exterior logistics, immediately locked the electronic key podium. He instructed his team of drivers to park the remaining vehicles and secure the perimeter. They turned off the exterior illumination, extinguishing the floodlights that showcased the expensive imported cars. The driveway faded into shadows. The escape route was secured, preventing anyone from demanding their vehicle until the final invoice dispute was settled. This was the invisible labor my family so casually mocked. They believed that wealth generated service through pure intimidation. They failed to understand that hospitality is a fragile ecosystem maintained by the grace of the working class. Savannah thought her white silk dress and her new surname made her a queen. She did not realize her kingdom was constructed on leased land, operated by people who held the actual power to plunge her into poverty. I sat in the darkness of my vehicle, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of the live band, continuing to play their oblivious, upbeat melodies. The musicians were the only vendors not directly wired to my communication network. They were contracted through a third-party agency, but their power supply belonged to me. I watched the silhouettes of the elite guests moving across the glowing window panes. They were dancing, laughing, drinking, and celebrating a lie. The mechanical withdrawal of the structural staff was the silent precursor to the final blow. I reached into the center console of my vehicle and retrieved my own administrative radio. I pressed the transmission button, feeling the cool plastic beneath my thumb. "Elias," I said, my voice steady and measured, "confirm status of the culinary and beverage withdrawal." "Kitchen is secured," Elias replied, his voice crackling through the small speaker. "Bar grates are locked. Service staff has retreated to the holding areas. The floor is abandoned. We are holding at step 2. "Very well," I murmured. The tactical dismantling of a high society illusion required patience. The guests inside had not yet realized their food and drinks had evaporated. They were still wrapped in the warm cocoon of the reception, but the foundation had been removed. The mansion was now an empty shell, operating on borrowed momentum. I looked up at the towering crystal chandelier, visible through the grand arched window of the ballroom. It blazed with hundreds of incandescent bulbs, consuming vast amounts of electricity to maintain the brilliant facade. The time had come to cut the cord. I sat in the driver's seat of my SUV parked in the shadows of the weeping willow. Through the tinted windshield, I watched the grand arched windows of the Peach Blossom estate. I did not need to be inside the room to know the exact sequence of events unfolding across the reclaimed pine floorboards. I had drafted the emergency shutdown procedure myself. I knew the precise moment the gears of their perfect evening ground to a halt. Inside the ballroom, the 12-piece brass and string ensemble was in the middle of a lively, upbeat jazz standard. The horn section blared a bright melody, encouraging the elite attendees to populate the polished oak dance floor. Savannah spun in the center of the crowd, her heavy silk gown flaring outward in a wide circle. She threw her head back, laughing for the videographer's lens. She believed she had just asserted her ultimate dominance over our family hierarchy. She believed her cruel public dismissal of me had cemented her status among the Atlanta elite forever. Then, the primary audio feed severed. The transition was far from graceful. A loud, sharp pop echoed through the towering speakers, followed by a heavy, digitized hum that died almost instantly. The horn players lowered their instruments, confused by the sudden drop in acoustics. The lead vocalist tapped her silver microphone, but it yielded only dead air. The musicians exchanged quick, knowing glances. They were contracted professionals, and their specific rider clearly stipulated that a venue power cut meant an immediate halt to the performance. Without waiting for instructions, the drummer began unbolting his cymbals. The cellist snapped her velvet protective case shut. The music evaporated, leaving a jarring, uncomfortable void in the cavernous space. Savannah stopped dancing. Her triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a deep, indignant scowl. She marched toward the elevated stage, her heels stomping against the hardwood. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice piercing the sudden quiet of the room. "You are contracted until midnight. Pick up your instruments and keep playing right now." The band leader, a seasoned veteran of high society temper tantrums, did not even look at her. He coiled a thick black audio cable around his elbow with practiced efficiency. "Ma'am, we have lost the primary circuit," he stated flatly. "The contract mandates we strike the set if the venue kills the power grid. We are done here." Savannah crossed her arms, shivering with rage. "Do you know who my father is?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the silent walls. "I will make sure you never book another event in the state of Georgia." The band leader zipped his canvas duffel bag closed. "Good luck with that," he replied, shouldering his equipment and walking off the back of the stage. Before Savannah could issue another empty threat, the visual environment shattered. The primary lighting grid shut down in synchronized waves. First, the ambient wall sconces flickered and died, plunging the perimeter of the room into deep shadows. Then the grand crystal chandeliers suspended above the dance floor lost their golden incandescent glow. The bulbs faded from brilliant yellow to dull orange before extinguishing entirely. The transition stripped the room of its manufactured warmth in a matter of seconds. A split second later, the auxiliary emergency circuits engaged. A row of sterile, dim, fluorescent security lights buzzed to life along the baseboards and above the exit doors. The warm, cinematic glow of the expensive reception was replaced by the harsh, unforgiving illumination of a concrete parking garage. The sensory shift was immediate and terrifying. 300 elite members of Georgia society gasped in unison. Women in custom-tailored evening gowns gripped the arms of their partners. Men in expensive tuxedos looked around the dim space, their postures stiffening with sudden vulnerability. The illusion of impenetrable luxury dissolved, exposing them to the raw structural reality of the building. The air conditioning units had also powered down, with the main breaker causing the heavy coastal humidity to seep through the window panes. The temperature in the room began to climb. The guests murmured in escalating confusion. A low, frantic buzzing sound filled the air as hundreds of attendees whispered, trying to calculate how a premier estate could suffer such a catastrophic failure. Richard Montgomery refused to look foolish in front of his wealthy new in-laws. He operated on the fundamental belief that loud demands could fix any mechanical issue. He pushed his way through the bewildered crowd, his face flushed crimson with embarrassment and anger. He bypassed the terrified bridesmaids and stormed toward the mirrored beverage alcove to demand an explanation from the bar staff. He expected to find groveling employees apologizing profusely for the inconvenience. Instead, he collided with a heavy iron security grate pulled tight over the counter. He rattled the metal bars, his hands shaking. The liquor cabinets behind the grate were locked tight. The bartenders were gone. The station was a deserted ghost town. Panic began to thread its way through Richard's arrogant facade. He abandoned the locked bar and marched toward the kitchen access corridor. "I pay for perfection," he muttered to himself, shoving the heavy, swinging wooden doors open. He marched into the culinary prep area, preparing to unleash a tirade on the executive chef. He stopped dead in his tracks. The sprawling industrial kitchen was barren. The stainless steel prep stations were wiped clean, gleaming under the sterile emergency lights. The warming ovens were empty. The knife racks were stripped bare. There was no smell of roasting meat or simmering sauces. There were no frantic cooks or scurrying waitstaff. The room was hollow, quiet, and meticulously abandoned. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow to the chest. This was not a blown fuse. This was a highly coordinated tactical evacuation. His family had been purposefully stranded. Back in the main ballroom, the reality of the situation crashed down on Savannah. She stood in the center of the dance floor, illuminated by a single harsh security bulb. Her perfect aesthetic was ruined. The videographers had lowered their cameras, unable to shoot in the dim lighting. The photographers were packing their lenses into padded backpacks. The audience she craved was no longer admiring her beauty. They were looking around in fear and annoyance, brushing past her to find better light. Savannah's chest began to heave. Short, shallow gasps escaped her throat. Her hands trembled as she gripped the fabric of her expensive lace gown. She was hyperventilating, her carefully constructed world collapsing in real time. The narrative she had built of being the untouchable princess of Atlanta was crumbling into dust. Preston stood a few feet away, looking helpless and pale. His parents, Arthur and Victoria, remained seated at the head table. Their posture had shifted from proud royalty to disgusted patrons. Victoria fanned herself with a linen napkin, her face a mask of supreme irritation. She looked at her son standing uselessly in the dark, and then looked at Savannah gasping for air on the dance floor. "This is what happens when you marry outside your element," Arthur muttered, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "They cannot even manage to keep the lights on for a simple dinner." Savannah heard the comment. A choked sob escaped her lips. The visual contrast was stark and unyielding. The Montgomery family, who had spent 8 months boasting about their prestige and negotiating fake discounts, now stood in a dark, silent room, stripped of the luxury they had claimed as their birthright. They looked small, fragile, and entirely fraudulent. The guests began pulling out their smartphones, using the pale blue light of their screens to illuminate the faces of the people next to them. The ballroom transformed into a holding cell filled with frightened socialites. They were trapped in a void of their own arrogance, awaiting a rescue that was never going to come. They expected a groveling manager to rush in and offer profound apologies alongside complimentary champagne. They did not expect the heavy footsteps echoing across the wooden stage. They did not expect a man in a tailored charcoal suit to step into the single beam of emergency light, holding a battery-powered megaphone. Elias had arrived to deliver the final verdict, and the true humiliation of the Montgomery family was about to be broadcast to the entire room. I sat in the leather driver's seat of my vehicle, staring at the dim silhouette of the estate. The administrative radio rested on the center console. I reached down and turned the volume knob to its highest limit. The static cleared, replaced by the ambient acoustics of the dark ballroom. The audio feed from Elias' lapel microphone flooded the quiet cabin of my car, bringing the panicked echoes of the reception directly to my ears. I could hear the frantic shuffling of expensive leather shoes against the floorboards. I heard the anxious whispers of the socialites. Then, I heard the sharp electronic screech of a battery-powered megaphone powering up. Elias stood in the single beam of emergency light, his voice transmitted through my speaker, crisp and devoid of any emotional waver. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, cutting through the rising panic, "may I have your attention, please?" A collective sigh of relief echoed through the audio feed. The guests assumed this was a routine technical apology. They expected Elias to promise a swift resolution and offer complimentary cocktails for the inconvenience. They were waiting to be coddled. "I regret to inform you that the power failure is not a mechanical issue," Elias continued, his tone lowering into a strict professional cadence. "Effective immediately, all operations at the Peach Blossom estate are permanently suspended. The reception is over." The radio picked up a chorus of outraged gasps. The polite veneer of the crowd fractured into genuine alarm. Then came the heavy thud of rapid footsteps. My father had returned from his failed expedition to the abandoned kitchen. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard shouted. His voice was breathless, ragged with exertion and fury. "You do not suspend a Montgomery event. I paid for this venue. Turn the lights back on right now, or I will have your job." Elias did not raise his voice to match my father's frantic energy. "Sir, the host party has violated the core parameters of the Master Services Agreement," Elias replied, "specifically the vendor and staff harassment clause outlined in Section 4, Paragraph B. Harassment. Richard spat the word out like poison. "What harassment? My daughter gave a toast. She told a joke. You are shutting down $1 million evening over a joke. I want the owner out here right now. Bring me the person who owns this property. I will buy them out and fire you in front of this entire crowd." I heard the distinct sound of Elias unsnapping the brass clasp of his leather corporate binder. He flipped a heavy parchment page. I smiled, leaning my head back against the headrest of my car. "I do not need to bring the owner out here, Mr. Montgomery," Elias stated. "The owner was sitting at table 19. You just authorized your daughter to evict her." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice faltering, losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. Elias cleared his throat and read directly from the legal operating agreement. The Peach Blossom Estate is a subsidiary of MHG Holdings. MHG Holdings is registered as Montgomery Hospitality Group. The sole proprietor and chief executive officer is Amelia Montgomery. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. The audio feed picked up nothing for 3 full seconds. No breathing, no shuffling, just a staggering, profound vacuum of sound. The wealthy attendees were rapidly processing the information. The woman they had just laughed out of the room did not run a small catering hobby. She owned the ground beneath their feet. She owned the roof over their heads. She held their entire evening in the palm of her hand, and they had cheered as she was insulted. "Amelia," my father whispered the name, catching in his throat. "It is impossible. She plans parties. She does not own real estate." The microphone picked up the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Arthur stepping forward. Preston's father had heard enough. His deep baritone voice rumbled through the speaker, laced with pure aristocratic disgust. "Let me ensure I understand this situation," Richard Arthur began. "You negotiated a venue contract with your own daughter. You allowed your youngest child to publicly degrade her, and you did not even possess the basic business acumen to read the corporate letterhead of the property you rented." "Arthur, please," Richard stammered, his bravado shattering into pathetic fragments. "It is a misunderstanding. Amelia is just acting out. She is jealous of Savannah." "Do not insult my intelligence," Richard Arthur snapped, the anger slicing through his polished exterior. "You are a fraud. You parade around Atlanta boasting about your leverage and your prestige, yet you cannot even afford to host a reception without begging your estranged daughter for a discount. You do not own anything. You lease your cars, you lease your office, and you apparently lease this wedding. Our family does not associate with pretenders." Savannah let out a high-pitched wailing sound. It pierced the audio feed, full of raw, unfiltered despair. "Preston," she sobbed, "tell your father to stop. Tell him we can fix this." Preston remained silent. His hesitation spoke volumes. He was a man who followed the money, and the money had just evaporated from the Montgomery side of the aisle. Savannah was realizing that her cruel grab for the spotlight had not elevated her. It had exposed her to the very people she was desperate to impress. The humiliation she intended for me had boomeranged, striking her with devastating precision. Her perfect day was a smoking crater, and she had lit the match herself. Elias raised the megaphone to his lips one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias announced, "the local authorities have been notified of the contract breach. You have 15 minutes to vacate the private premises before the exterior gates are locked. The valet podium is closed. You will need to walk to the designated parking perimeter to retrieve your vehicles. Please proceed to the nearest exit." I reached out and clicked the radio off. The sudden quiet in my vehicle mirrored the cold finality of the eviction. I looked through the windshield. The heavy entrance doors of the estate swung open. Guests in expensive evening wear began pouring out onto the dark gravel driveway. They held the hems of their gowns, tripping over the uneven stones in the dim moonlight. They were murmuring in hushed, frantic voices, casting judgmental glances back at the building they were fleeing. The social hierarchy of Atlanta was rewriting itself on my front lawn. The attendees who had sneered at me an hour prior were now marching through the coastal humidity, stripped of their dignity. They had to navigate the long, winding gravel path in their designer heels to find their luxury vehicles. The illusion of royal convenience was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of trespassing on private property. I watched Arthur and Victoria emerge from the double doors. They walked with stiff, angry postures, refusing to look back. Preston trailed closely behind them, leaving his new bride inside the dark foyer. The old money had seen enough. They were cutting their losses and distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of the Montgomery brand. I started the engine of my customized SUV. The low, powerful rumble of the motor broke the silence of my cabin. I shifted the vehicle into drive. I did not wait to see my parents emerge. I did not need to witness my sister weeping over her ruined dress in the shadows of the empty ballroom. The structural damage was done. The facade was shattered beyond repair. I drove slowly down the private service road, bypassing the stream of evicted guests trudging along the main driveway. My headlights cut through the dark salt marsh, illuminating the ancient live oaks that guarded my property. The wedding was officially terminated, but the financial and legal reckoning was only just beginning. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over the Georgia coast, and my family would wake up to a nightmare drafted on my corporate letterhead. The drive took 40 minutes, navigating the dark, winding roads that cut through the dense Georgia pine forests. I did not turn on the radio. I let the hum of the engine and the quiet rhythm of the tires rolling over the asphalt serve as my soundtrack. I was driving away from a disaster site, but my pulse remained calm and steady. My primary residence was a restored 19th century farmhouse situated on 40 acres of private land. I bought the property 5 years ago when the roof was sagging and the foundation was rotting into the soil. My parents had refused to visit, calling it a rural nightmare unfit for a Montgomery. I spent 2 years restoring the original heart pine floors and reinforcing the structural beams with my own hands. I planted a small orchard in the backyard. It was quiet. It was solid. It was mine. I parked the customized SUV on the gravel driveway and killed the engine. The crickets were singing in the tall grass. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the cool, silent foyer. There were no crystal chandeliers here. There was no imported Italian marble designed to intimidate guests. There was only the faint scent of beeswax wood polish and fresh lavender cut from the garden. I kicked off my heels, feeling the smooth, worn wood beneath my bare feet. I walked into the kitchen. The countertops were made of dark soapstone, cool to the touch. I reached into a woven basket resting on the center island and picked up a fresh Georgia peach. The skin was fuzzy and warm, yielding slightly under the pressure of my thumb. I took a bite, letting the sweet juice run over my tongue. It tasted like victory. I set my phone down on the soapstone counter. The screen was already illuminated, glowing like a beacon in the dim kitchen. The notifications were rolling in like a rising tide. I tapped the voicemail icon. The digital counter indicated 27 missed calls and 14 new audio messages. The fallout was happening in real time, and they were desperately trying to drag me back into the blast radius. My father had left the first 4 messages in the span of 12 minutes. I tapped the screen to play the first recording. His voice was a volatile mixture of disbelief and raw authoritarian rage. "Amelia, you pick up this phone right now," he demanded, his words slurring slightly from the bourbon. "You do not walk away from your family. You call that manager and you turn the lights back on. You are embarrassing me in front of Arthur. I will not have my reputation destroyed by a disobedient child. Call me back immediately." I chewed a slice of the peach, swallowing slowly. The second voicemail arrived 3 minutes later. The rage had cracked, revealing the desperate, fragile core beneath his arrogant exterior. The reality of the blackout had clearly set in. "Please, Amelia," Richard begged the authority, entirely stripped from his tone, leaving only a pathetic whine. "Arthur is threatening to pull his investments from my firm. He says we are frauds. He says we leased the wedding and humiliated his family. You have to fix this. You have to call Elias and tell them it was a mechanical error. Tell them the generator blew. Name your price, Amelia. I will pay you whatever you want. Just fix my image." I deleted Richard's messages with a single swipe of my finger. He still believed money could buy his way out of a structural collapse. He still believed I was a vendor waiting for a bribe. He did not understand that I was the landlord collecting a debt. I moved to the next audio file. Savannah was sobbing. It was not her usual theatrical crying designed to elicit sympathy from our mother. It was the ugly, wet sound of genuine panic. The recording was filled with the sound of crunching gravel, indicating she was walking outside in the dark. "Amelia, please pick up," she choked out between ragged breaths. "Preston left. He left in the car with his parents. He left me in the dark. Victoria told him to file for an annulment tomorrow morning. She said our family is toxic trash." Savannah gasped for air. Her carefully constructed world shattered into microscopic pieces. "They are going to erase me, Amelia. They are going to pretend this wedding never happened. Please call the estate. Tell them I am sorry. Tell them I will do whatever they want. Just get the lights back on so Preston will come back." I listened to the dial tone. She was not apologizing for what she did to me. She was apologizing because she got caught. She was mourning the loss of the legacy surname, not the loss of her sister. I deleted her message without a second thought. Then the screen illuminated with a new text message from my mother. It contained no apologies. It contained no acknowledgement of the cruelty I had endured at Table 19. It was a simple, familiar command crafted to manipulate my deepest psychological wiring. "Family carries family. Amelia, please fix this." I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. For a brief, fleeting second, my chest tightened. The old internal conditioning flared to life, burning like a hot coal in my stomach. For 3 decades, I had been trained to absorb their failures. When my father made a bad investment, I quietly paid the property taxes on his house to prevent foreclosure. When Savannah ruined a relationship, I smoothed things over with the injured party. The urge to pick up the phone and execute a damage control protocol was deeply ingrained in my psychology. It was a heavy, invisible chain wrapping around my lungs, urging me to submit to my designated role as the family shock absorber. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard. My brain automatically began drafting a crisis management email to the estate staff, preparing to issue a false statement about a blown transformer. The instinct to protect them was a reflex forged by a lifetime of emotional neglect. I closed my eyes, taking another slow bite of the peach. I let the tart sweetness ground me in the present reality. I opened my eyes and looked across the kitchen island. Resting next to the woven basket was a duplicate copy of the Master Services Agreement. The thick cream parchment bore the bold signatures of Richard and Savannah Montgomery. The legal architecture was flawless. I reached out and touched the heavy paper. The tactile sensation of the contract severed the invisible chain. I read Clause 4B one more time. The words were a shield protecting my dignity. I was no longer the custodian of their mistakes. I was the architect of my own boundaries. I did not owe them a rescue. They had built their own cage and locked the door from the inside. I pulled my hand back from the contract and picked up my phone. I did not type a response to my mother. I did not leave a voicemail for my father. I toggled the small switch on the side of the device, engaging the silent mode. The screen faded to black, plunging their frantic demands, their annulment threats, and their desperate pleas into an empty digital void. I finished eating, washing my hands in the deep copper farm sink. I dried my fingers on a linen towel and walked up the wooden stairs to my bedroom. I did not check my phone again. I pulled the heavy linen quilt over my shoulders and closed my eyes. Outside the window, the crickets chirped in the tall meadow grass. The Georgia night was peaceful and deep, wrapping my farmhouse in a blanket of supreme security. I drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing that across the county, my family's social standing was burning to the ground, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. Tomorrow, the smoke would clear, and they would finally have to look at the invoice. Morning sunlight filtered through the sheer linen curtains of my kitchen, casting long, warm shadows across the soapstone island. I stood at the counter, waiting for my French press to finish brewing. The farmhouse was wrapped in a profound Sunday stillness. I poured the dark roast coffee into a ceramic mug, letting the rich, bitter aroma fill the room. Beside the mug rested a thick manila envelope. I had printed the documents an hour prior, collating the pages with precise, deliberate movements. The quiet sanctuary of my property shattered at exactly 8 o'clock. The crunching of heavy tires tearing up my gravel driveway signaled their arrival. I looked out the kitchen window. Richard's leased European SUV skidded to a halt near the front porch, kicking up a cloud of white dust. The doors swung open before the engine even cut off. My father, my mother, and my sister marched toward my house, operating on a toxic cocktail of adrenaline, panic, and misplaced righteous fury. When I was a teenager living under their roof, they used to ambush my bedroom just like this. Whenever Savannah misplaced a piece of jewelry or received a poor grade on a report card, my parents would burst through my door and demand I fix the situation. They operated on the assumption that my boundaries were non-existent, and my sole purpose was to absorb their collateral damage. They expected that old dynamic to hold today. They expected to yell, demand submission, and force me to draft a public apology to save their fractured image. Heavy fists pounded against my solid oak front door. The dull thud reverberated through the hallway. "Amelia, open this door right now," Richard shouted, his voice muffled by the thick wood. I picked up my coffee mug in my left hand. I picked up the manila envelope in my right. I walked down the corridor, my bare feet silent against the floorboards. I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the door inward. I did not step back. I stood firmly in the threshold, using my body to physically block their entry. The visual presentation of the Montgomery family was a stark departure from the polished aristocrats who had posed in the peach orchard yesterday. Richard wore yesterday's wrinkled dress shirt, his collar unbuttoned and his tie missing. His face was pale and unshaven, displaying the raw exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire night begging his wealthy in-laws for forgiveness. Caroline wore a silk blouse, buttoned unevenly, her eyes bloodshot and swollen. Savannah looked the worst. Her face was stained with streaked mascara. She clutched a designer handbag to her chest like a shield. The smug, triumphant bride who had commanded a ballroom less than 12 hours ago was gone. In her place stood a terrified woman whose husband had abandoned her in a dark foyer. "You vindictive little snake," Richard hissed, stepping forward until his expensive leather shoes touched my welcome mat. He pointed a shaking finger inches from my face. "Do you have any idea what you have done? Arthur canceled the financial merger. He is pulling his commercial accounts from my firm on Monday morning. You ruined my business. You ruined your sister's marriage." Caroline pushed past him, tears brimming in her eyes. "How could you do this, Amelia?" she sobbed, her voice trembling with practiced manipulation. "We are your family. You humiliated us in front of the entire county. You need to call the local papers today. You are going to issue a statement claiming the venue suffered a catastrophic electrical grid failure. You are going to take the blame for the blackout." Savannah let out a ragged, wet gasp. "Preston will not even answer my text messages," she cried, her voice cracking. "His mother blocked my number. You have to fix this. You have to tell them you were just acting out because you were jealous." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The hot liquid grounded me. I looked at the three of them standing on my porch, demanding that I set myself on fire to keep their illusions warm. "I am not issuing a statement," I said, my voice calm and devoid of any emotional inflection. "I am not taking the blame for a shutdown that Savannah explicitly caused, and you are trespassing on my property." Richard let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You think you hold the cards because you own some catering hall?" he spat. "I am calling my attorneys tomorrow morning. I am going to sue you for breach of contract. I will sue you for emotional distress. I will tie your little hospitality company up in litigation for the next decade until you are forced to declare bankruptcy. You messed with the wrong man, Amelia." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to match his escalating volume. Arguing with arrogant people only validates their delusion that their opinions matter. Instead, I extended my right arm and handed the manila envelope to my father. "You will need to give that to your attorneys," I told him. Richard snatched the envelope from my hand, his face twisting in confusion. "What is this?" he demanded. "It is the final invoice," I replied, taking another sip of coffee. "Payable upon receipt." He ripped the wax seal open, tearing the thick paper in his haste. He pulled out the itemized ledger. I watched his eyes scan the top of the document. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. When Caroline originally demanded a favor, I instructed my manager Elias to draft a contract with a 70% reduction on the venue rental, the catering, and the floral design. It was a courtesy discount designed to make my parents feel superior. However, the vendor and staff harassment clause carried a very specific financial penalty. Because the contract was terminated due to a host-side breach, the promotional discount is legally nullified, I explained, watching Richard's hands begin to shake as he read the numbers. The invoice reflects the full premium rate of the Peach Blossom Estate weekend buyout. Richard flipped to the second page, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. Furthermore, I continued my tone, remaining strictly procedural. The invoice includes the unmitigated cost of the luxury catering. It also includes the emergency hazard pay I authorized for the makeup artists, the culinary brigade, and the valet staff who endured your verbal abuse. You will also find a line item for the structural damage caused to the copper floral arch, which required emergency stabilization. Caroline leaned over her husband's shoulder to look at the document. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp. "Richard, this cannot be right," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual commanding presence. "This number is astronomical. We do not have this kind of liquidity." The grand total resting at the bottom of the ledger was staggering. It represented the true cost of renting an elite historic property for 300 guests without a single financial concession. It was a figure that Richard Montgomery could not possibly cover without liquidating his personal assets or remortgaging his home. "You cannot do this," Richard stammered, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "We signed an agreement for the reduced rate. You cannot just change the numbers after the fact." "I did not change the numbers, Richard, I said, using his first name to sever the parental dynamic. "You changed the parameters. You signed a legally binding master services agreement holding you liable for the behavior of your guests. You failed to control the bride. The penalty is clearly outlined on page 12. Savannah snatched the invoice out of her father's hands. She stared at the total, her eyes darting back and forth across the zeros. She dropped the paperwork onto the porch as if the paper itself burned her fingers. "I am not paying a dime of this," Savannah shrieked, backing away toward the driveway. "This is your fault, Dad. You negotiated the venue. You signed the paperwork. I am the victim here. My marriage is ruined. I have nothing to do with this debt." I set my coffee mug on the wooden railing of the porch. I reached down and picked up the scattered pages from the floorboards. I sifted through the stack until I found the event insurance rider attached to the back of the primary agreement. "Actually, Savannah, you have everything to do with it," I said, extending the page toward her. Savannah stared at the document, refusing to take it. When Elias processed the final paperwork, he required a secondary signature for the liability insurance. I explained, pointing to the cursive ink on the bottom line. Since Richard was claiming the event as a corporate expense under his firm, we needed the primary beneficiary of the event to co-sign the policy. "Look at the signature, Savannah." Savannah leaned forward, her breath hitching in her throat. Right there on the dotted line was her own elegant sweeping signature. She had been so eager to see her new hyphenated surname on an official document, she had signed it without reading the liability clauses attached to the insurance rider. "You are a legal co-signer on the master agreement," I told her, securing the trap around her ankles. "If Richard defaults on this invoice, my holding company will initiate collection proceedings against you and your new husband. I am sure Preston will be thrilled to discover he married into a crippling commercial debt on his wedding night." Savannah let out a hollow, devastated sound. She covered her mouth with both hands, realizing the true magnitude of her arrogance. She had not just humiliated herself in front of Atlanta society. She had legally bound herself to a financial anchor that would drag her under the water. "You are a monster," Richard whispered, his voice devoid of strength. "I am a businesswoman," I corrected him. "I provided a service. You breached the terms. The bill is due. You have 30 days to remit payment before my legal team places a lien on your firm. Have a wonderful Sunday." I stepped backward into my foyer and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The brass deadbolt clicked into place with a loud finality, locking them out of my peace and trapping them in their own ruin. 48 hours after I secured the deadbolt on my farmhouse door, the battlefield relocated from my front porch to a corporate boardroom. Tuesday morning brought a relentless coastal rainstorm sweeping across the Georgia coastline. Sheets of gray water lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive office. I sat behind a broad walnut desk, reviewing quarterly profit margins. The temperature in the room was climate-controlled, maintaining a crisp, steady coolness. The intercom on my desk buzzed, a short, sharp tone. Elias spoke through the speaker. "Your father is here, Amelia. He brought legal representation. They are demanding an immediate audience." "Send them in," I instructed, keeping my gaze fixed on the financial spreadsheets. The heavy glass door swung open. Richard Montgomery marched into the room. His face carried a deep, flushed crimson hue, signaling his escalating blood pressure. The exhaustion from Sunday morning had morphed into a desperate, forceful fury. He was accompanied by a tall, slender man, wearing a bespoke pinstripe suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. This was not a family dispute anymore. This was a calculated strike designed to intimidate me into submission. When I was a teenager, Richard used to bring his junior associates to the house for dinner. He would force me to serve the appetizers while he boasted about his courtroom victories. He spent years cultivating the illusion that he was a legal titan holding court over the lesser citizens of Atlanta. He brought a shark into my waters today, expecting me to bleed. "Take a seat, gentlemen," I offered, gesturing toward the twin leather guest chairs positioned opposite my desk. "We will stand," Richard snapped, his voice echoing off the polished concrete walls. "This is Charles Croft. He is a senior partner at the most prestigious litigation firm in the state. We are not here to negotiate your extortion attempt. We are here to deliver a mandate." Croft stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the edge of my walnut desk. He unlatched the brass locks with a soft click. He did not offer a handshake. He looked at me with the practiced condescension of a man accustomed to bullying small business owners. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. Miss Montgomery Croft began, his tone slick and measured. Your father retained my services to address the fraudulent invoice you issued over the weekend. We have drafted a formal complaint. If you do not withdraw this ridiculous financial demand by noon today, we will file this injunction with the county clerk. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, resting my hands on the armrests. On what grounds, Mr. Croft? Breach of contract, Croft stated, tapping the paperwork. Emotional distress, defamation of character. You unilaterally terminated a high-value event without proper cause, leaving 300 esteemed guests stranded in the dark. You subjected the Montgomery family to extreme public humiliation. A judge will pierce your corporate veil, freeze your hospitality assets, and award my client punitive damages that will bankrupt your entire operation. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, offering a smug, vindicated smile. I told you Sunday morning, Amelia, you messed with the wrong man. You thought you could pull a fast one on your own flesh and blood. Now you are going to lose everything you built. I looked at the drafted complaint resting on my desk. I did not reach for it. I did not read the allegations. The threats were predictable, built on the assumption that I would fold under the pressure of a potential lawsuit. They relied on fear to win their battles. I relied on airtight documentation. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I retrieved a single slim manila folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the blotter, directly adjacent to Croft's towering stack of threats. Mr. Croft, I said, keeping my voice smooth and unbothered, before you file that injunction, I highly recommend you review the actual master services agreement your client signed. It appears he failed to provide you with a comprehensive evidentiary record. I opened the folder. Inside rested the original contract bearing Richard's signature. I slid the document across the smooth walnut surface, stopping inches from the lawyer's fingertips. I used a bright yellow marker to highlight a specific block of text on page 12. Please read Clause 4B aloud, I instructed. Croft frowned, his professional confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. He picked up the page, adjusting his reading glasses. He cleared his throat. Any verbal abuse, public humiliation, or hostile behavior directed at the service staff, the vendors, or the ownership grants the property management unilateral authority to cease all operations immediately. Croft read the words, hanging heavily in the quiet office. No warnings are required. No refunds will be issued. Any promotional discounts are instantly voided, rendering the host liable for the premium balance. He stopped reading. His eyes darted from the highlighted text down to the bold signature at the bottom of the page. He recognized my father's handwriting. The termination was not unilateral without cause, I explained, steepling my fingers together. The termination was explicitly triggered by the bride. Savannah Montgomery utilized a microphone to degrade the venue owner in front of 300 witnesses. She issued a direct hostile command for the ownership to vacate the premises. The contract executed exactly as designed. Richard slammed his fist onto the desk. That is hearsay, he roared. It is your word against ours. You cannot prove anything. A judge will toss that clause out the window the second we testify that you orchestrated this entire scheme out of petty jealousy. We will swear under oath that you fabricated the harassment. I smiled, a slow, chilling smile that caused the seasoned litigator to tense his shoulders. It is not hearsay, Richard, I replied. You seem to have forgotten the extensive media coverage Savannah demanded for her perfect day. She hired 3 separate luxury videography teams to document every single moment of the reception. The color drained from Richard's face faster than the receding tide outside my window. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Those videographers were contracted to capture high-definition footage with multi-directional audio. I continued, letting the reality of the situation crush his remaining bravado. Their cameras were rolling when Savannah took the stage. They captured the insults. They captured the laughter. They recorded her explicit command for me to leave my own building. That footage does not belong to you. It belongs to the independent production company, and they are legally obligated to comply with a court-issued subpoena. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk, closing the physical distance between us. If you file that lawsuit, Mr. Croft, I will immediately file a countersuit for breach of contract and unpaid debts, I stated, outlining the tactical checkmate. During the discovery phase, my legal team will subpoena the raw, unedited video files. That footage will be entered into the public court record. It will become a matter of public domain. I shifted my gaze to my father. He was staring at the highlighted contract, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You worship the society pages, Richard," I said, my tone dropping into a lethal whisper. "You crave the respect of the Atlanta elite. What do you think will happen when the local news outlets acquire a high-definition video of your daughter acting like a deranged tyrant? What will the country clubs say when they watch Savannah drunkenly harass a service provider? Your reputation will not just be tarnished, it will be incinerated." Croft swallowed hard. He was a smart man. He understood the lethal combination of airtight paperwork and incontrovertible video evidence. He recognized a losing battle. He slowly reached out and pulled the drafted complaint back toward his side of the desk, sliding it into his leather briefcase. "The documents speak for themselves," I told my father, breaking the suffocating silence. "The trap is closed. You can pay the invoice quietly, or you can go to court and lose loudly. The choice is yours, but the price remains exactly the same." Richard looked at his expensive attorney, searching for a lifeline. He found only a grim professional surrender. Croft snapped his briefcase shut. "We need to discuss our options in private," Richard the lawyer murmured, heading toward the glass door. "We cannot win a public trial with video evidence contradicting our primary claim. The liability is undeniable." My father stood frozen in the center of the office. The realization crashed over him in heavy, suffocating waves. He was trapped in a legally airtight cage built entirely by his own arrogance. The power dynamic that had defined our family for 3 decades permanently shifted in that precise moment. He was no longer the imposing patriarch dispensing judgment from a leather chair. He was a debtor standing in my headquarters, realizing he lacked the capital to survive the winter. He turned and walked out of the office, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The glass door clicked shut, leaving me alone with the rhythmic sound of the rain lashing against the windows. The legal battle was won without a single court filing, yet securing the financial victory meant initiating a deeply uncomfortable process that would force my parents to liquidate their most prized possessions. The financial resolution of the Peach Blossom Estate incident did not require a dramatic courtroom verdict. It simply required the cold, unyielding mechanics of cause and effect. The truth is a relentless force. You can attempt to bury it under designer clothing and country club memberships, but it always finds a way to surface. For the Montgomery family, the truth surfaced on the first of every single month. Preston did not file for an annulment. He lacked the courage to endure the public scrutiny of a 48-hour marriage. Instead, he remained tethered to Savannah, forming a union defined not by love, but by mutual resentment and crippling commercial debt. Arthur cut his son off from the primary family trust fund. The old money patriarch was horrified by the fraudulent spectacle and refused to subsidize a family he viewed as toxic pretenders. He mandated that Preston and Savannah clear the venue invoice utilizing their own salaries. Every 30 days, a certified bank draft arrives at the accounting department of Montgomery Hospitality Group. It covers the monthly installment of the premium venue rental, the hazard pay, and the catering costs. The payments dictate the harsh boundaries of Savannah's new reality. She cannot afford luxury vacations. She cannot purchase seasonal designer wardrobes. She lives in a modest suburban townhome far away from the elite downtown penthouses she spent her entire life hunting. She is forced to budget her groceries while remitting thousands of dollars to the sister she tried to erase. The financial prison she built for herself offers no chance of early parole. The social fallout for my parents proved equally devastating. In the enclosed ecosystem of Georgia high society, gossip functions as the primary currency. The story of the blackout wedding spread through the exclusive dining rooms and manicured golf courses faster than a coastal hurricane. The narrative was brutal and highly accurate. Everyone knew Richard and Caroline had leased a venue they could not afford and terrorized the staff until the owner pulled the plug. My father lost his most lucrative clients within 3 weeks. The wealthy investors who once trusted his firm recognized that a man who could not secure his own daughter's reception had no business managing their generational wealth. His downtown corner suite grew quiet. The phone stopped ringing. He spends his days sitting on his synthetic putting green surrounded by empty leather chairs and the heavy silence of his own irrelevance. Caroline experienced a different variety of exile. Her punishment was delivered through polite Southern smiles and unreturned phone calls. The charity steering committee she once ruled with an iron fist began to quietly distance themselves. A letter arrived at her home printed on heavy cream cardstock. The board of directors thanked her for her years of dedicated service and gently suggested she take an indefinite leave of absence to focus on private family matters. She was excised from the elite rosters with surgical precision. She now eats lunch alone at the country club, pretending not to notice the averted gazes of the women who used to hang on her every word. I did not gloat over their downfall. I did not send them boastful text messages or parade my success in front of their fractured lives. Retribution is a hollow pursuit. Enforcing a boundary is a necessary act of survival. I simply closed the door and focused my energy on the empire I built. The industry response to the blackout wedding transformed the trajectory of my business. In the hospitality sector, workers are accustomed to enduring abuse in silence. They are conditioned to accept mistreatment as an occupational hazard. When the caterers, the florists, and the production crews across the state learned that a venue owner actually executed a termination clause to protect her staff, the respect I garnered was profound. The finest culinary talents and elite event designers began approaching Montgomery Hospitality Group, seeking exclusive employment contracts. They wanted to work for the woman who shielded her team from arrogant clients. My properties flourished. We became the most sought-after event conglomerate on the coast, operating with a waitlist that extends 5 years into the future. My success is not derived from intimidation or false prestige. It is forged from mutual respect, quiet competence, and a fierce dedication to the people who perform the actual labor. Early this morning, I drove out to the Peach Blossom Estate. The property was quiet, resting in the tranquil window between the dawn and the arrival of the weekend staff. A thick layer of silver fog rolled off the salt marsh, clinging to the ancient branches of the live oaks. The air smelled of wet earth and sweet blossoms. I walked across the damp grass, navigating the edge of the sprawling orchard. I moved toward the flagstone terrace where the rehearsal dinner had taken place months prior. The space was empty, waiting for the next celebration to fill its borders. I approached the stone balustrade overlooking the dark water of the bay. Standing near the edge of the patio was the heavy copper floral arch. It was stripped of its hydrangeas and eucalyptus, resting bare against the coastal breeze. I knelt on the cold stone, inspecting the base of the structure. The thick metal bolt I had drilled into the mortar remained exactly where I left it. It was sturdy, unyielding, and deeply rooted into the foundation. I ran my fingers over the cold brass metal. For 3 decades, I believed that family was a permanent, unchangeable structure. I believed I was obligated to spend my life serving as the hidden support beam for people who refused to acknowledge my worth. I thought endurance was the only currency that mattered. I stood up, looking out over the vast expanse of my estate. The morning sun pierced through the fog, painting the horizon in vibrant strokes of gold and crimson. The truth is that biology is merely a starting point. It does not demand a lifetime of subjugation. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep arrogant people warm. You are allowed to stop fixing their mistakes. You are allowed to hand them the invoice for the damage they cause. The family I was born into only valued me for the discomfort I was willing to subsidize. The empire I built values me for my mind, my resilience, and my unwavering integrity. I took a deep breath of the clean coastal air, feeling a profound sense of peace settle into my chest. The noise of my past was finally silenced, leaving only the steady hum of my own chosen future. The quietest women truly hold the loudest boundaries. We do not need to shout to establish our dominance. We simply wait for the arrogant to stumble into the traps they set for themselves, and then we hand them the bill. If this story resonated with you, and you understand the power of walking away from toxic entitlement, then you belong here. Hit that like button and leave a comment below, sharing a time you enforced a boundary that changed your life. Remember to subscribe and follow the channel Morning Revenge for more stories about quiet victories and undeniable justice. Keep your boundaries firm, and I will see you in the next one. The image of 300 elite guests plunged into the sudden, suffocating darkness of the Peach Blossom Estate is far more than a dramatic climax. It is a profound, chilling metaphor for the inevitable collapse of an illusion. When we look at the wreckage of the Montgomery family, we do not just see a ruined high society wedding. We see the rotting foundation of a family structure built on performative love, toxic favoritism, and the dangerous commodification of children. This narrative holds a mirror up to the modern American family, demanding a deep, uncomfortable reflection on what it truly means to raise a child with integrity, responsibility, and emotional awareness. At the heart of this tragedy is a devastating critique of how parenting values can become warped by the relentless pursuit of status. In a culture that frequently equates visible, material success with moral virtue, Richard and Caroline Montgomery confused provision with promotion. They believed they were acting as good traditional parents by aggressively engineering Savannah's ascent into old money. Yet in their desperate scramble for prestige, they abandoned the fundamental tenets of family responsibility: absolute fairness, radical honesty, and unconditional emotional support. They raised Savannah not to be a woman of character, but a fragile, arrogant performer who believed her worth was entirely tethered to her aesthetic and her surname. Conversely, they weaponized Amelia's competence. They viewed her resilience not as a virtue to be nurtured and celebrated, but as a utility to be exploited. Within the traditional family structure, parents are meant to be the steady architects of a child's worldview, tasked with laying a foundation of absolute fairness. But when a family system relies on a scapegoat to function, when it demands that one child shrink so another can expand, the architecture is inherently flawed. Honesty in family life means facing uncomfortable truths about our children's shortcomings and our own internal biases. The Montgomerys could not bear the honesty of their financial reality, so they forced Amelia to subsidize their delusion. Emotional awareness demands that we look at our children and see their inherent soul, not their utility. It is the profound realization that a child's duty is not to serve as a blank canvas for a parent's unresolved insecurities. A message to American parents: the true legacy of family. To parents raising children in the complex, highly competitive landscape of American society, this story serves as a stark, urgent warning. We often speak of leaving a legacy for our children, visualizing trust funds, sprawling property, and pristine reputations. But a legacy built on deception and the exploitation of one sibling for the benefit of another is a house of cards waiting for a strong wind. The truest, most enduring legacy you can impart to your children is an unbreakable moral compass. Traditional family education must actively prioritize character over credentials. Teach your children that their dignity is not tied to a country club membership, a designer label, or an elite zip code, but to how they treat the people who serve them. Teach them that actions have inescapable, sometimes brutal consequences. If you endlessly shield your children from the weight of their own mistakes, if you demand that someone else step in to pay their emotional or financial debts, you are not protecting them. You are spiritually handicapping them. You are raising a Savannah, a person terrified of the dark because she has never been taught how to generate her own light. Genuine parenting requires the bravery to let your children fail, to let them face the invoice for their arrogance, so they may learn the vital, life-saving mechanics of humility. A message to youth: the power of quiet industry. If Amelia Montgomery could speak directly to the young people navigating the turbulent waters of family expectations and early adulthood, her message would be one of fierce, uncompromising self-ownership. Your worth is not determined by the people who underestimate you. Do not internalize the roles that dysfunctional systems try to assign to you out of their own convenience. If you are labeled the worker bee, the fixer, or the spinster in the trenches, realize that these are not insults. They are accidental testaments to your capacity to survive. Let them underestimate you. Use the shadows they force you into to build your own empire. Competence is a quiet, undeniable superpower. You do not need to scream for validation or tear others down to prove your value. Focus on your craft, read the fine print, and build a foundation so solid that no one can ever charge you rent for your own existence. True power does not announce itself with a microphone. It reveals itself when the lights go out. The Observer's Lens, a spiritual call to self-cultivation. When observing this narrative and the broader state of modern society from the perspective of a spiritual practitioner, a deeper, more resonant lesson emerges. We are living in an era severely afflicted by the disease of optics, a cultural sickness where the appearance of a thing is valued far more than the essence of the thing itself. The Montgomery parents were spiritually bankrupt long before they received that final invoice. They suffered from a profound lack of self-cultivation. A spiritual practitioner would recognize that the true poverty in this story does not belong to the daughter who scrubs baseboards, but to the parents who require a captive audience just to feel alive. Self-cultivation is the quiet daily practice of pulling the weeds of ego, greed, and vanity from our own minds. It is the deliberate development of a resilient inner core that does not shatter when the world ceases to applaud. When we fail to cultivate our own wisdom, we inevitably try to extract it from others. We must teach ourselves and our children that a better life is not one filled with luxury, but one filled with peace. Morality is not a costume we wear to a high society event. It is the quiet choice we make when we are entirely unobserved. The Montgomerys failed the test of the unobserved moment, treating their daughter with casual cruelty behind closed doors, only to be judged for it in the most public way imaginable. Resilience is not forged in the comforts of a leased luxury venue. It is forged in the honest moments of confronting our own shadows. If you are walking your own path of quiet resilience, if you are learning to stop paying the invoice for the arrogance of others, and are ready to claim your own unyielding space in this world, you are not alone. Follow Morning Revenge for more stories, reflections, and insights into finding justice and building your empire in the shadows. We are building a community of those who know that true strength is silent. The final reflection: we are culturally conditioned to believe that family is an unconditional harbor, that shared blood dictates an infinite capacity for forgiveness, and that keeping the peace is the ultimate virtue of a dutiful child. We are taught that to abandon our family in their moment of ruin is the ultimate moral failure, a betrayal of the highest order. But perhaps the conventional wisdom is entirely backward. Sometimes the most destructive thing you can do for a person is to continually save them. To endlessly absorb the consequences of someone else's toxic entitlement is not an act of love. It is an act of complicity. It robs them of the rock bottom they so desperately need in order to grow. The true moral failure is allowing a lie to stand unchallenged just because it is comfortable. Therefore, walking away, flipping the breaker, and letting the darkness fall is not an act of vengeance. It is a profound, albeit agonizing, act of clarity. Sometimes the most compassionate way to teach people how to truly see is to turn out the lights and leave them alone in the dark. About Morning Revenge and my content creation process. Dear YouTube team, my name is Tan, and I am the owner and creator of the YouTube channel Morning Revenge. I would like to briefly introduce my channel and explain how I research, create, produce, and publish my content. Morning Revenge is a storytelling channel primarily created for women ages 25 and older, including viewers over 55. My stories focus on family relationships, parental favoritism, unfair treatment, emotional conflicts, and difficult situations between parents, children, and siblings. The main message behind my stories is simple. Parents should treat all of their children fairly with love, respect, and compassion. Through fictional and dramatized stories, I hope to encourage parents to reflect on the emotional consequences of favoritism, while also providing viewers with engaging and meaningful entertainment. Creating content is my profession and an important part of my career. I take YouTube's policies seriously, including the community guidelines, copyright policies, reused content policies, advertiser-friendly content guidelines, and other platform requirements. I regularly follow policy updates and continuously improve my workflow to remain compliant. My research and creative process: I often research topics through public discussions on communities, such as Reddit storytelling trends on YouTube and YouTube Studio's inspiration features. These sources help me understand what topics may interest my audience. However, I do not simply copy or republish other creators' videos or finished stories. I use research as inspiration and then develop my own storyline, characters, conflicts, dialogue, emotional progression, and ending. For script development, I use Gemini as an AI-assisted writing and brainstorming tool. It helps me organize ideas and explore different storytelling possibilities. I personally review, edit, and revise the material before publication, checking the story structure, logic, dialogue, emotional development, and overall message. AI is a tool in my workflow while I remain responsible for the final creative decisions. Production and editing. After completing the script, I use for narration and voiceover. I then prepare visual materials to support different parts of the story. I may also use relaxing footage to create a comfortable viewing experience for audiences listening to the story. I use to edit the final video, including narration, synchronization, scene, timing, transitions, visuals, and overall pacing. For thumbnails, I use Canva to create a thumbnail specifically designed around each video's story and central conflict. Before publishing, I carefully review the completed video, including the script, narration, visuals, editing, and thumbnail. Audience engagement and my commitment. I regularly read and respond to viewer comments and use the Community tab to communicate with my audience. Their feedback helps me understand what they enjoy and how I can improve future content. I understand the importance of maintaining high standards for monetized content, and I sincerely respect YouTube's review process. I kindly ask the YouTube team to consider my complete creative process when reviewing Morning Revenge. My goal is to create original storytelling experiences through research, creative development, writing, narration, visual production, editing, and continuous audience engagement. I am committed to continuing to learn, improve, and follow YouTube's policies. Thank you very much for taking the time to review my channel and understand the work behind my content. Sincerely, Tan, owner and creator of Morning Revenge,